Chapter 1 of the Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 1, in which we begin not to understand. It is not without a certain emotion that I begin to recount here the extraordinary adventures of Joseph Rouletabille. Down to the present time, he had so firmly opposed my doing it, that I had come to despair of ever publishing the most curious of police stories of the past 15 years. I had even imagined that the public would never know the whole truth of the prodigious case known as that of the Yellow Room, out of which grow so many mysterious, cruel, and sensational dramas, with which my friend was so closely mixed up, if, propos of a recent nomination of the illustrious Stangerson to the grade of Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor, an evening journal, in an article miserable for its ignorance, or audacious for its perfidy, had not resuscitated a terrible adventure of which Joseph Rouletabille had told me he wished to be for ever forgotten. The Yellow Room. Who now remembers this affair which caused so much ink to flow 15 years ago? Events are so quickly forgotten in Paris. Has not the very name of the Nayves trial and the tragic history of the death of little Menaldo passed out of mind? And yet the public attention was so deeply interested in the details of the trial that the occurrence of a ministerial crisis was completely unnoticed at the time. Now the Yellow Room trial, which preceded that of the Nayves by some years, made far more noise. The entire world hung for months over this obscure problem, the most obscure, it seems to me, that has ever challenged the perspicacity of our police or taxed the conscience of our judges. The solution of the problem baffled everybody who tried to find it. It was like a dramatic rebus, of which old Europe and New America alike became fascinated. That is, in truth, I am permitted to say, because there cannot be any author's vanity in all this, since I do nothing more than transcribe facts on which an exceptional documentation enables me to throw a new light. That is because, in truth, I do not know that, in the domain of reality or imagination, one can discover or recall to mind anything comparable, in its mystery, with the natural mystery of the Yellow Room. That which nobody could find out, Joseph Rouletabille, aged 18, then a reporter engaged on a leading journal, succeeded in discovering. But when, at the assize court, he brought in the key to the whole case, he did not tell the whole truth. He only allowed so much of it to appear as sufficed to ensure the acquittal of an innocent man. The reasons which he had for his reticence no longer exist. Better still, the time has come for my friend to speak out fully. You are going to know all, and without further preamble, I am going to place before your eyes the problem of the Yellow Room as it was placed before the eyes of the entire world on the day following the enactment of the drama at the Château du Glandier. On the 25th of October 1892, the following note appeared in the latest edition of the Temps. A frightful crime has been committed at the Glandier, on the border of the forest of Sainte-Geneviève, above Épinay-sur-Orge, at the house of Professor Stangerson. On that night, while the master was working in his laboratory, an attempt was made to assassinate Mademoiselle Stangerson, who was sleeping in a chamber adjoining this laboratory. The doctors could not answer for the life of Mademoiselle Stangerson. The impression made on Paris by this news may be easily imagined. Already at that time the learned world was so deeply interested in the labors of Professor Stangerson and his daughter. These labors, the first that were attempted in radiography, served to open the way for Monsieur and Madame Curie to the discovery of radium. It was expected the professor would shortly read to the Academy of Sciences a sensational paper on his new theory, the dissociation of matter, a theory destined to overthrow from its base the whole of official science, which based itself on the principle of the conservation of energy. On the following day the newspapers were full of the tragedy. The Matin, among others, published the following article, entitled "A Supernatural Crime." "These are the only details," wrote the anonymous writer in the Matin, "we have been able to obtain concerning the crime of the Chateau du Glandier, the state of despair in which Professor Stangerson is plunged, and the impossibility of getting any information from the lips of the victim, have rendered our investigations and those of justice so difficult that at present we cannot form the least idea of what has passed in the Yellow Room, in which Mademoiselle Stangerson, in her night-dress, was found lying on the floor in the agonies of death. We have at last been able to interview Daddy Jacques, as he is called in the country, an old servant in the Stangerson family. Daddy Jacques entered the room at the same time as the professor. This chamber adjoins the laboratory. Laboratory and Yellow Room are in a pavilion at the end of the park, about 300 meters, 1,000 feet, from the chateau. It was 12:30 at night, this honest old man told us, and I was in the laboratory, where Monsieur Stangerson was still working, when the thing happened. I had been cleaning and putting instruments in order all the evening, and was waiting for Monsieur Stangerson to go to bed. Mademoiselle Stangerson had worked with her father up to midnight. When the 12 strokes of midnight had sounded by the cuckoo clock in the laboratory, she rose, kissed Monsieur Stangerson, and bade him good night. To me she said, "Bonsoir, Daddy Jacques," as she passed into the Yellow Room. We heard her lock the door and shoot the bolt, so that I could not help laughing, and said to Monsieur, "There's Mademoiselle double-locking herself in. She must be afraid of the Bete du bon Dieu." Monsieur did not even hear me, he was so deeply absorbed in what he was doing. Just then we heard the distant meowing of a cat. "Is that going to keep us awake all night?" I said to myself, for I must tell you, Monsieur, that to the end of October I live in an attic of the pavilion over the Yellow Room, so that Mademoiselle should not be left alone through the night in the lonely park. It was the fancy of Mademoiselle to spend the fine weather in the pavilion. No doubt she found it more cheerful than the chateau, and for the 4 years it had been built, she had never failed to take up her lodging there in the spring. With the return of winter, Mademoiselle returns to the chateau, for there is no fireplace in the Yellow Room. We were staying in the pavilion then, Monsieur Stangerson and me. We made no noise. He was seated at his desk. As for me, I was sitting on a chair, having finished my work, and looking at him, I said to myself, "What a man! What intelligence! What knowledge!" I attach importance to the fact that we made no noise, for because of that the assassin certainly thought that we had left the place. And suddenly, while the cuckoo was sounding the half after midnight, a desperate clamour broke out in the Yellow Room. There was the voice of Mademoiselle, crying "Murder! Murder! Help!" Immediately afterwards revolver shots rang out, and there was a great noise of tables and furniture being thrown to the ground, as if in the course of a struggle, and again the voice of Mademoiselle calling "Murder! Help! Papa! Papa!" You may be sure that we quickly sprang up, and that Monsieur Stangerson and I threw ourselves upon the door. But alas! it was locked, fast locked, on the inside, by the care of Mademoiselle, as I have told you, with key and bolt. We tried to force it open, but it remained firm. Monsieur Stangerson was like a madman, and truly it was enough to make him one, for we heard Mademoiselle still calling "Help! Help!" Monsieur Stangerson showered terrible blows on the door, and wept with rage and sobbed with despair and helplessness. It was then that I had an inspiration. "The assassin must have entered by the window," I cried. "I will go to the window." And I rushed from the pavilion and ran like one out of his mind. The inspiration was that the window of "The Yellow Room" looks out in such a way that the park wall, which abuts in the pavilion, prevented my at once reaching the window. To get up to it one has first to go out of the park. I ran towards the gate and, on my way, met Bernier and his wife, the gatekeepers, who had been attracted by the pistol reports and by our cries. In a few words I told them what had happened, and directed the concierge to join Monsieur Stangerson with all speed, while his wife came with me to open the park gate. 5 minutes later she and I were before the window of "The Yellow Room". The moon was shining brightly, and I saw clearly that no one had touched the window. Not only were the bars that protect it intact, but the blinds inside of them were drawn, as I had myself drawn them early in the evening, as I did every day, though Mademoiselle, knowing that I was tired from the heavy work I had been doing, had begged me not to trouble myself, but leave her to do it. And they were just as I had left them, fastened with an iron catch on the inside. The assassin, therefore, could not have passed either in or out that way. But neither could I get in. It was unfortunate enough to turn one's brain. The door of the room locked on the inside, and the blinds on the only window also fastened on the inside. And Mademoiselle still calling for help. No, she had ceased to call. She was dead perhaps, but I still heard her father, in the pavilion, trying to break down the door. With the concierge I hurried back to the pavilion. The door, in spite of the furious attempts of Monsieur Stangerson and Bernier to burst it open, was still holding firm, but at length it gave way before our united efforts. And then, what a sight met our eyes! I should tell you that, behind us, the concierge held a laboratory lamp, a powerful lamp, that lit the whole chamber. I must also tell you, monsieur, that "The Yellow Room" is a very small room. Mademoiselle had furnished it with a fairly large iron bedstead, a small table, a night commode, a dressing table, and 2 chairs. By the light of the big lamp we saw all at a glance. Mademoiselle, in her night dress, was lying on the floor in the midst of the greatest disorder. Tables and chairs had been overthrown, showing that there had been a violent struggle. Mademoiselle had certainly been dragged from her bed. She was covered with blood, and had terrible marks of finger-nails on her throat, the flesh of her neck having been almost torn by the nails. From the wound on the right temple a stream of blood had run down and made a little pool on the floor. When Monsieur Stangerson saw his daughter in that state, he threw himself on his knees beside her, uttering a cry of despair. He ascertained that she still breathed. As to us, we searched for the wretch who had tried to kill our mistress, and I swear to you, monsieur, that, if we had found him, it would have gone hard with him. But how to explain that he was not there, that he had already escaped? It passed all imagination. Nobody under the bed, nobody behind the furniture. All that we discovered were traces, blood-stained marks of a man's large hand on the walls and on the door, a big handkerchief red with blood, without any initials, an old cap, and many fresh footmarks of a man on the floor, footmarks of a man with large feet, whose boot-soles had left a sort of sooty impression. How had this man got away? How had he vanished? Don't forget, monsieur, that there is no chimney in "The Yellow Room". He could not have escaped by the door, which is narrow, and on the threshold of which the concierge stood with the lamp, while her husband and I searched for him in every corner of the little room, where it is impossible for anyone to hide himself. The door, which had been forced open against the wall, could not conceal anything behind it, as we assured ourselves. By the window, still in every way secured, no flight had been possible. What then? I began to believe in the devil. But we discovered my revolver on the floor. Yes, my revolver! Oh, that brought me back to the reality. The devil would not have needed to steal my revolver to kill Mademoiselle. The man who had been there had first gone up to my attic and taken my revolver from the drawer where I kept it. When then ascertained, by counting the cartridges, that the assassin had fired 2 shots. Oh, it was fortunate for me that Monsieur Stangerson was in the laboratory when the affair took place, and had seen with his own eyes that I was there with him, for otherwise, with this business of my revolver, I don't know where we should have been. I should now be under lock and bar. Justice wants no more to send a man to the scaffold." The editor of the Matin added to this interview the following lines: "We have, without interrupting him, allowed Daddy Jacques to recount to us roughly all he knows about the crime of The Yellow Room. We have reproduced it in his own words, only sparing the reader of the continual lamentations with which he garnished his narrative. It is quite understood, Daddy Jacques, quite understood, that you are very fond of your masters, and you want them to know it, and never cease repeating it, especially since the discovery of your revolver. It is right, and we see no harm in it. We should have liked to put some further questions to Daddy Jacques, Jacques Louis Moustier, but the inquiry of the examining magistrate, which is being carried out at the chateau, makes it impossible for us to gain admission at the Glandier, and, as to the oak wood, it is guarded by a wide circle of policemen, who are jealously watching all traces that can lead to the pavilion, and that may perhaps lead to the discovery of the assassin. We have also wished to question the concierges, but they are invisible. Finally, we have waited in a roadside inn, not far from the gate of the chateau, for the departure of Monsieur de Marquet, the magistrate of Corbeil. At 5:30 we saw him and his clerk, and, before he was able to enter his carriage, had an opportunity to ask him the following question: "Can you, Monsieur de Marquet, give us any information as to this affair, without inconvenience to the course of your inquiry?" "It is impossible for us to do it," replied Monsieur de Marquet. "I can only say it is the strangest affair I have ever known. The more we think we know something, the further we are from knowing anything." We asked Monsieur de Marquet to be good enough to explain his last words, and this is what he said, the importance of which no one will fail to recognize. "If nothing is added to the material facts so far established, I fear that the mystery which surrounds the abominable crime of which Mademoiselle Stangerson has been the victim will never be brought to light. But it is to be hoped, for the sake of our human reason, that the examination of the walls and of the ceiling of The Yellow Room, an examination which I shall tomorrow entrust to the builder who constructed the pavilion 4 years ago, will afford us the proof that may not discourage us. For the problem is this: we know by what way the assassin gained admission. He entered by the door and hid himself under the bed, awaiting Mademoiselle Stangerson. But how did he leave? How did he escape? If no trap, no secret door, no hiding-place, no opening of any sort is found, if the examination of the walls, even to the demolition of the pavilion, does not reveal any passage practicable, not only for a human being, but for any being whatsoever, if the ceiling shows no crack, if the floor hides no underground passage, one must really believe in the devil, as Daddy Jacques says." And the anonymous writer in the Matin added in this article, which I have selected as the most interesting of all those that were published on the subject of this affair, that the examining magistrate appeared to place a peculiar significance to the last sentence: "One must really believe in the devil, as Jacques says." The article concluded with these lines: "We want to know what Daddy Jacques meant by the cry of the Bete du Bon Dieu. The landlord of the Donjon Inn explained to us that it is the particularly sinister cry which is uttered sometimes at night by the cat of an old woman. Mother Agenoux, as she is called in the country. Mother Agenoux is a sort of saint who lives in a hut in the heart of the forest, not far from the grotto of Sainte Geneviève. The Yellow Room, the Bête du Bon Dieu, Mother Agenoux, the Devil, Sainte Geneviève, Daddy Jacques, here is a well-entangled crime which the stroke of a pickaxe in the wall may disentangle for us tomorrow. Let us at least hope that, for the sake of our human reason, as the examining magistrate says. Meanwhile, it is expected that Mademoiselle Stangerson, who has not ceased to be delirious and only pronounces one word distinctly, "Murderer, murderer," will not live through the night. In conclusion, and at a late hour, the same journal announced that the chief of the Sûreté had telegraphed to the famous detective Frederic Larsan, who had been sent to London for an affair of stolen securities, to return immediately to Paris. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stuart Bell. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 2, in which Joseph Rouletabille appears for the first time. I remember, as well as if it occurred yesterday, the entry of young Rouletabille into my bedroom that morning. It was about 8 o'clock, and I was still in bed reading the article in the Matin relative to the Glandier crime. But before going further, it's time that I present my friend to the reader. I first knew Joseph Rouletabille when he was a young reporter. At that time I was a beginner at the bar, and often met him in the corridors of examining magistrates, when I had gone to get a permit to communicate for the prison of Mazas or for Saint-Lazare. He had, as they say, a good nut. He seemed to have taken his head, round as a bullet, out of a box of marbles, and it's from that, I think, that his comrades of the press, all determined billiard players, had given him that nickname, which was to stick to him and be made illustrious by him. He was always as red as a tomato, now gay as a lark, now grave as a judge. How, while still so young, he was only 16½ years old when I saw him for the first time, had he already won his way on the press? That was what everybody who came into contact with him might have asked if they had not known his history. At the time of the affair of the woman cut in pieces in the Rue Oberskampf, another forgotten story, he had taken to one of the editors of the Epoque, a paper then rivaling the Matin for information, the left foot, which was missing from the basket in which the gruesome remains were discovered. For this left foot the police had been vainly searching for a week, and young Rouletabille had found it in a drain where nobody had thought of looking for it. To do that, he had dressed himself as an extra sewerman, one of a number engaged by the administration of the city of Paris owing to an overflow of the Seine. When the editor-in-chief was in possession of the precious foot, and informed as to the train of intelligent deductions the boy had been led to make, he was divided between the admiration he felt for such detective cunning in a brain of a lad of 16 years, and delight at being able to exhibit, in the morgue window of his paper, the left foot of the Rue Oberskampf. "This foot," he cried, "will make a great headline." Then, when he had confided the gruesome packet to the medical lawyer attached to the journal, he asked the lad, who was shortly to become famous as Rouletabille, what he would expect to earn as a general reporter on the Epoque. 200 francs a month, the youngster replied modestly, hardly able to breathe from surprise at the proposal. "You shall have 250, said the editor-in-chief, "only you must tell everybody that you have been engaged on the paper for a month. Let it be quite understood that it was not you, but the Epoque that discovered the left foot of the Rue Oberskampf. Here, my young friend, the man is nothing, the paper everything." Having said this, he begged the new reporter to retire, but before the youth had reached the door, he called him back to ask his name. The other replied, "Joseph Josephine." "That's not a name," said the editor-in-chief, "but since you will not be required to sign what you write, it is of no consequence." The boy-faced reporter speedily made himself many friends, for he was serviceable and gifted with a good humour that enchanted the most severe-tempered and disarmed the most zealous of his companions. At the bar cafe, where the reporters assembled before going to any of the courts or to the prefecture in search of their news of crime, he began to win a reputation as an unraveller of intricate and obscure affairs which found its way to the office of the chief of the Sûreté. When the case was worth the trouble, and Rouletabille, he had already been given his nickname, had been started on the scent by his editor-in-chief, he often got the better of the most famous detective. It was at the bar cafe that I became intimately acquainted with him. Criminal lawyers and journalists are not enemies. The former need advertisement, and the latter information. We chatted together, and I soon warmed towards him. His intelligence was so keen and so original, and he had a quality of thought such as I have never found in any other person. Some time after this I was put in charge of the law news of the Cri de Boulevard. My entry into journalism could not but strengthen the ties which united me to Rouletabille. After a while, my new friend being allowed to carry out an idea of a judicial correspondence column, which he was allowed to sign "Business" in the Epoque, I was often able to furnish him with the legal information of which he stood in need. Nearly 2 years passed in this way, and the better I knew him, the more I learned to love him. For, in spite of his careless extravagance, I had discovered in him what was, considering his age, an extraordinary seriousness of mind. Accustomed as I was to seeing him gay, and indeed often too gay, I would many times find him plunged in the deepest melancholy. I tried then to question him as to the cause in this change of humour, but each time he laughed and made me no answer. One day, having questioned him about his parents, of whom he never spoke, he left me, pretending not to have heard what I said. While things were in this state between us, the famous case of the Yellow Room took place. It was this case which was to rank him as the leading newspaper reporter, and to obtain for him the reputation of being the greatest detective in the world. It should not surprise us to find in the one man the perfection of 2 such lines of activity, if we remember that the daily press was already beginning to transform itself and to become what it is today, the Gazette of Crime. Morose-minded people may complain of this. For myself, I regard it a matter for congratulation. We can never have too many arms, public or private, against the criminal. To this, some people may answer that, by continually publishing the details of crimes, the press ends by encouraging their commission. But then with some people, we can never do right. Rouletabille, as I have said, entered my room that morning of the 26th of October, 1892. He was looking redder than usual, and his eyes were bulging out of his head, as the phrase is, and altogether he appeared to be in a state of extreme excitement. He waved the Matin with a trembling hand, and cried, "Well, my dear Sinclair, have you read it?" "The Glandier crime?" "Yes, the Yellow Room. What do you think of it?" "I think that it must have been the devil or the Bête de Bon Dieu that committed the crime." "Be serious." "Well, I don't much believe in murderers who make their escape through walls of solid brick. I think Daddy Jack did wrong to leave behind him the weapon with which the crime was committed, and as he occupied the attic immediately above Mademoiselle Stangerson's room, the builder's job ordered by the examining magistrate will give us the key of the enigma. It won't be long before we learn by what natural trap, or by what secret door, the old fellow was able to slip in and out, and return immediately to the laboratory to Monsieur Stangerson, without his absence being noticed. That, of course, is only a hypothesis." Rouletabille sat down in an armchair, lit his pipe, which he was never without, smoked for a few minutes in silence, no doubt to calm the excitement which visibly dominated him, and then replied. "Young man," he said, in a tone the sad irony of which I will not attempt to render, Young man, you are a lawyer, and I doubt not your ability to save the guilty from conviction. But if you were a magistrate on the bench, how easy it would be for you to condemn innocent persons. You are really gifted, young man. He continued to smoke energetically, and then went on. No trap will be found, and the mystery of the Yellow Room will become more and more mysterious. That's why it interests me. The examining magistrate is right. Nothing stranger than this crime has ever been known. Have you any idea of the way by which the murderer escaped? I asked. None, replied Rouletabille. None for the present. But I have an idea as to the revolver. The murderer did not use it. Good heavens! By whom then was it used? Why, by Mademoiselle Stangerson. I don't understand. Or rather, I've never understood, I said. Rouletabille shrugged his shoulders. Is there nothing in this article in the Matin by which you were particularly struck? Nothing. I found the whole of the story it tells equally strange. Well, but the locked door, with the key on the inside. That's the only perfectly natural thing in the whole article. Really? And the bolt? The bolt? Yes, the bolt, also inside the room, a still further protection against entry. Mademoiselle Stangerson took quite extraordinary precautions. It's clear to me that she feared someone. That was why she took such precautions, even Daddy Jack's revolver, without telling him of it. No doubt she didn't wish to alarm anybody, and least of all her father. What she dreaded took place, and she defended herself. There was a struggle, and she used the revolver skilfully enough to wound the assassin in the hand, which explains the impression on the wall and on the door of the large blood-stained hand of the man who was searching for a means of exit from the chamber. But she didn't fire soon enough to avoid the terrible blow on the right temple. Then the wound on the temple was not done with a revolver. The paper doesn't say it was, and I don't think it was, because, logically, it appears to me that the revolver was used by Mademoiselle Stangerson against the assassin. Now, what weapon did the murderer use? Well, the blow on the temple seems to show that the murderer wished to stun Mademoiselle Stangerson after he had unsuccessfully tried to strangle her. He must have known that the attic was inhabited by Daddy Jack, and that was one of the reasons, I think, why he must have used a quiet weapon, a life-preserver or a hammer. All that doesn't explain how the murderer got out of the Yellow Room, I observed. Evidently, replied Rouletabille, rising, and that is what has to be explained. I am going to the Chateau du Glandier, and have come to see whether you will go with me. I? Yes, my boy, I want you. The Epoque has definitely entrusted this case to me, and I must clear it up as quickly as possible. But in what way can I be of any use to you? Monsieur Robert Darzac is at the Chateau du Glandier. That's true. His despair must be boundless. I must have a talk with him. Rouletabille said it in a tone that surprised me. Is it because you think there's something to be got out of him? I asked. Yes. That was all he would say. He retired to my sitting room, begging me to dress quickly. I knew Monsieur Robert Darzac from having been of great service to him in a civil action while I was acting as secretary to Maître Barbet de la Tour. Monsieur Robert Darzac, who was at that time about 40 years of age, was a professor of physics at the Sorbonne. He was intimately acquainted with the Stangersons, and after an assiduous 7 years' courtship of the daughter, had been on the point of marrying her. In spite of the fact that she has become, as the phrase goes, a person of a certain age, she was still remarkably good-looking. While I was dressing, I called out to Rouletabille, who was impatiently moving about my sitting-room. Have you any idea as to the murderer's station in life? Yes, he replied. I think if he isn't a man in society, he is at least a man belonging to the upper class. But that, again, is only an impression. What has led you to form it? Well, the greasy cap, the common handkerchief, and the marks of the rough boots on the floor, he replied. I understand, I said. Murderers don't leave traces behind them which tell the truth. We shall make something out of you yet, my dear Sinclair, concluded Rouletabille. End of chapter 2. Recording by Stuart Bell, Cambridge, UK.
Chapter 3 of the Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 3. A man has passed like a shadow through the blinds. Half an hour later, Rouletabille and I were on the platform of the Orléans station, awaiting the departure of the train which was to take us to Épinay-sur-Orge. On the platform we found Monsieur de Marquet and his registrar, who represented the judicial court of Corbeil. Monsieur Marquet had spent the night in Paris, attending the final rehearsal at the Scala of a little play of which he was the unknown author, signing himself simply Castigat-Ridendo. Monsieur de Marquet was beginning to be a noble old gentleman. Generally he was extremely polite and full of gay humour, and in all his life had had but one passion, that of dramatic art. Throughout his magisterial career he was interested solely in cases capable of furnishing him with something in the nature of a drama. Though he might very well have aspired to the highest judicial positions, he had never really worked for anything but to win a success at the romantic Porte Saint-Martin or at the sombre Odéon. Because of the mystery which shrouded it, the case of the Yellow Room was certain to fascinate so theatrical a mind. It interested him enormously, and he threw himself into it, less as a magistrate eager to know the truth than as an amateur of dramatic imbroglios, tending wholly to mystery and intrigue, who dreads nothing so much as the explanatory final act. So that, at the moment of meeting him, I heard Monsieur de Marquet say to the registrar, with a sigh, "I hope, my dear Monsieur Maleine, this builder with his pickaxe will not destroy so fine a mystery." "Have no fear," replied Monsieur Maleine. "His pickaxe may demolish the pavilion, perhaps, but it will leave our case intact. I have sounded the walls and examined the ceiling and floor, and I know all about it. I am not to be deceived." Having thus reassured his chief, Monsieur Maleine, with a discreet movement of the head, drew Monsieur de Marquet's attention to us. The face of that gentleman clouded, and as he saw Rouletabille approaching, hat in hand, he sprang into one of the empty carriages, saying, half aloud to his registrar, as he did so, "Above all, no journalists!" Monsieur Maleine replied in the same tone, "I understand," and then tried to prevent Rouletabille from entering the same compartment with the examining magistrate. "Excuse me, gentlemen, this compartment is reserved." "I am a journalist, monsieur, engaged on the 'Epoque,'" said my young friend with a great show of gesture and politeness, "and I have a word or two to say to Monsieur de Marquet." "Monsieur is very much engaged with the inquiry he has in hand." "Ah, his inquiry, pray believe me, is absolutely a matter of indifference to me. I am no scavenger of odds and ends," he went on with infinite contempt in his lower lip. "I am a theatrical reporter, and this evening I shall have to give a little account of the play at the Scala." "Get in, sir, please," said the registrar. Rouletabille was already in the compartment. I went in after him and seated myself by his side. The registrar followed and closed the carriage door. Monsieur de Marquet looked at him. "Ah, sir," Rouletabille began, "you must not be angry with Monsieur de Maleine. It is not with Monsieur de Marquet that I desire to have the honor of speaking, but with Monsieur Castigat-Ridendo. Permit me to congratulate you, personally as well as the writer for the 'Epoque'." And Rouletabille, having first introduced me, introduced himself. Monsieur de Marquet, with a nervous gesture, caressed his beard into a point, and explained to Rouletabille, in a few words, that he was too modest an author to desire that the veil of his pseudonym should be publicly raised, and that he hoped the enthusiasm of the journalist for the dramatist's work would not lead him to tell the public that Monsieur Castigat Ridendo and the examining magistrate of Corbeil were one and the same person. The work of the dramatic author might interfere, he said, after a slight hesitation, with that of the magistrate, especially in a province where one's labours are little more than routine. "Oh, you may rely on my discretion," cried Rouletabille. The train was in motion. "We have started," said the examining magistrate, surprised at seeing us still in the carriage. "Yes, monsieur, truth has started," said Rouletabille, smiling amiably, "on its way to the Chateau du Glandier. A fine case, Monsieur de Marquet, a fine case. An obscure, incredible, unfathomable, inexplicable affair, and there is only one thing I fear, Monsieur Rouletabille, that the journalist will be trying to explain it." My friend felt this a rap on his knuckles. "Yes," he said simply, "that is to be feared. They meddle in everything. As for my interest, monsieur, I only referred to it by mere chance, the mere chance of finding myself in the same train with you, and in the same compartment of the same carriage." "Where are you going, then?" asked Monsieur de Marquet. "To the Chateau du Glandier," replied Rouletabille, without turning. "You'll not get in, Monsieur Rouletabille." "Will you prevent me?" said my friend, already prepared to fight. "Not I. I like the press and journalists too well to be in any way disagreeable to them. But Monsieur Stangerson has given orders for his door to be closed against everybody, and it is well guarded. Not a journalist was able to pass through the gate of the Glandier yesterday." Monsieur de Marquet compressed his lips and seemed ready to relapse into obstinate silence. He only relaxed a little when Rouletabille no longer left him in ignorance of the fact that we were going to the Glandier for the purpose of shaking hands with an old and intimate friend, Monsieur Robert Darzac, a man whom Rouletabille had perhaps seen once in his life. "Poor Robert," continued the young reporter. "This dreadful affair may be his death. He is so deeply in love with Mademoiselle Stangerson. His sufferings are truly painful to witness," escaped like a regret from the lips of Monsieur de Marquet. "But it is to be hoped that Mademoiselle Stangerson's life will be saved." "Let us hope so. Her father told me yesterday that if she does not recover, it will not be long before he joins her in the grave. What an incalculable loss to science his death will be!" "The one on her temple is serious, is it not?" "Evidently, but by a wonderful chance it has not proved mortal. The blow was given with great force." "Then it was not with a revolver she was wounded," said Rouletabille, glancing at me in triumph. Monsieur de Marquet appeared greatly embarrassed. "I didn't say anything. I don't want to say anything. I will not say anything," he said, and he turned towards his register as if he no longer knew us. But Rouletabille was not to be so easily shaken off. He moved nearer to the examining magistrate, and, drawing a copy of the Matin from his pocket, he showed it to him and said, "There is one thing, monsieur, which I may inquire of you without committing an indiscretion. You have, of course, seen the account given in the Matin? It is absurd, is it not?" "Not in the slightest, monsieur." "What? The Yellow Room has but one barred window, the bars of which have not been moved, and only one door, which had to be broken open, and the assassin was not found." "That's so, monsieur, that's so. That's how the matter stands." Rouletabille said no more, but plunged into thought. A quarter of an hour thus passed. Coming back to himself again, he said, addressing the magistrate, "How did Mademoiselle Stangerson wear her hair on that evening?" "I don't know," replied Monsieur de Marquet. "That is a very important point," said Rouletabille. "Her hair was done up in bands, wasn't it? I feel sure that on that evening, the evening of the crime, she had her hair arranged in bands." "Then you are mistaken, Monsieur Rouletabille," replied the magistrate. "Mademoiselle Stangerson that evening had her hair drawn up in a knot on the top of her head, her usual way of arranging it, her forehead completely uncovered. I can assure you, for we have carefully examined the wound, there was no blood on the hair, and the arrangement of it has not been disturbed since the crime was committed." "You are sure? You are sure that, on the night of the crime, she had not her hair in bands?" "Quite sure," the magistrate continued, smiling, "because I remember the doctor saying to me, while he was examining the wound, 'It is a great pity Mademoiselle Stangerson was in the habit of drawing her hair back from her forehead. If she had worn it in bands, the blow she received on the temple would have been weakened.' It seems strange to me that you should attach so much importance to this point." "Oh, if she had not her hair in bands, I give it up," said Rouletabille, with a despairing gesture. "And was the wound on her temple a bad one?" he asked presently. "Terrible!" "With what weapon was it made?" "That is a secret of the investigation." "Have you found the weapon, whatever it was?" The magistrate did not answer. "And the wound in her throat?" Here the examining magistrate readily confirmed the decision of the doctor that, if the murderer had pressed her throat a few seconds longer, Mademoiselle Stangerson would have died of strangulation. "The affair as reported in the 'Matin,'" said Rouletabille eagerly, "seems to be more and more inexplicable. Can you tell me, monsieur, how many openings there are in the pavilion? I mean doors and windows." "There are 5," replied Monsieur de Marquet, after having coughed once or twice, but no longer resisting the desire he felt to talk of the whole of the incredible mystery of the affair he was investigating. "There are 5, of which the door of the vestibule is the only entrance to the pavilion, a door always automatically closed, which cannot be opened, either from the outer or the inside, except with the 2 special keys which are never out of possession of either Daddy Jacques or Monsieur Stangerson. Mademoiselle Stangerson had no need for one, since Daddy Jacques lodged in the pavilion and because, during the daytime, she never left her father. When they all 4 rushed into The Yellow Room, after breaking open the door of the laboratory, the door in the vestibule remained closed as usual, and of the 2 keys for opening it, Daddy Jacques had one in his pocket, and Monsieur Stangerson the other. As to the windows of the pavilion, there are 4, the one window of The Yellow Room and those of the laboratory looking out on to the country, the window in the vestibule looking into the park. It is by that window that he escaped from the pavilion," cried Rouletabille. "How do you know that?" demanded Monsieur de Marquet, fixing a strange look on my young friend. "We'll see later how he got away from The Yellow Room," replied Rouletabille. "But he must have left the pavilion by the vestibule window." "Once more, how do you know that?" "How? Oh, the thing is simple enough. As soon as he found he could not escape by the door of the pavilion, his only way out was by the window in the vestibule, unless he could pass through a grated window. The window of The Yellow Room is secured by iron bars, because it looks out upon the open country. The 2 windows of the laboratory have to be protected in like manner, for the same reason. As the murderer got away, I conceive that he found a window that was not barred, that of the vestibule, which opens on to the park, that is to say, into the interior of the estate. There's not much magic in all that." "Yes," said Monsieur de Marquet, "but what you have not guessed is that this single window in the vestibule, though it has no iron bars, has solid iron blinds. Now these iron blinds have remained fastened by their iron latch, and yet we have proof that the murderer made his escape from the pavilion by that window. Traces of blood on the inside wall and on the blinds as well as on the floor, and footmarks, of which I have taken the measurement, attest the fact that the murderer made his escape that way. But then, how did he do it, seeing that the blinds remained fastened on the inside? He passed through them like a shadow. But what is more bewildering than all is that it is impossible to form any idea as to how the murderer got out of The Yellow Room, or how he got across the laboratory to reach the vestibule. Ah yes, Monsieur Rouletabille, it is altogether as you said, a fine case, the key to which will not be discovered for a long time, I hope." "You hope, monsieur?" Monsieur de Marquet corrected himself. "I do not hope so, I think so." "Could that window have been closed and refastened after the flight of the assassin?" asked Rouletabille. "That is what occurred to me for a moment, but it would imply an accomplice or accomplices, and I don't see—" After a short silence, he added, "Ah, if Mademoiselle Stangerson were only well enough today to be questioned!" Rouletabille followed up his thought and asked, "And the attic, there must be some opening to that?" "Yes, there is a window, or rather skylight, in it, which, as it looks out towards the country, Monsieur Stangerson has had barred like the rest of the windows. These bars, as in the other windows, have remained intact, and the blinds, which naturally opened inwards, have not been unfastened. For the rest, we have not discovered anything to lead us to suspect that the murderer had passed through the attic." "It seems clear to you, then, monsieur, that the murderer escaped, nobody knows how, by the window in the vestibule?" "Everything goes to prove it." "I think so too," confessed Rouletabille gravely. After a brief silence, he continued, "If you have not found any traces of the murderer in the attic, such as the dirty footmarks similar to those on the floor of The Yellow Room, you must come to the conclusion that it was not he who stole Daddy Jacques' revolver." "There are no footmarks in the attic other than those of Daddy Jacques himself," said the magistrate, with a significant turn of his head. Then, after an apparent decision, he added, "Daddy Jacques was with Monsieur Stangerson in the laboratory, and it was lucky for him he was." "Then what part did his revolver play in the tragedy? It seems very clear that this weapon did less harm to Mademoiselle Stangerson than it did to the murderer." The magistrate made no reply to this question, which doubtless embarrassed him. "Monsieur Stangerson," he said, "tells us that the 2 bullets have been found in The Yellow Room, one embedded in the wall stained with the impression of a red hand, a man's large hand, and the other in the ceiling." "Oh, in the ceiling," muttered Rouletabille. "In the ceiling. That's very curious. In the ceiling." He puffed a while in silence at his pipe, enveloping himself in the smoke. When we reached Savigny-sur-Orge, I had to tap him on the shoulder to arouse him from his dream and come out on to the platform of the station. There, the magistrate and his registrar bowed to us, and by rapidly getting into a cab that was awaiting them, made us understand that they had seen enough of us. "How long will it take to walk to the Chateau du Glandier?" Rouletabille asked one of the railway porters. "An hour and a half or an hour and 3/4, easy walking," the man replied. Rouletabille looked up at the sky, and, no doubt, finding its appearance satisfactory, took my arm and said, "Come on, I need a walk." "Are things getting less entangled?" I asked. "Not a bit of it," he said. "More entangled than ever. It is true I have an idea—" "What's that?" I asked. "I can't tell you what it is just at present. It's an idea involving the life or death of 2 persons at least. Do you think there were accomplices?" "I don't think it." We fell into silence. Presently he went on. "It was a bit of luck, our falling in with that examining magistrate and his registrar, eh? What did I tell you about that revolver?" His head was bent down, he had his hands in his pockets, and he was whistling. After a while I heard him murmur, "Poor woman." "Is it Mademoiselle Stangerson you're pitying?" "Yes, she's a noble woman, and worthy of being pitied. A woman of great, very great character, I imagine. I imagine. You know her, then? Not at all. I have never seen her. Why, then, do you say that she is a woman of great character? Because she bravely faced the murderer, because she courageously defended herself, and, above all, because of the bullet in the ceiling. I looked at Rouletabille, and inwardly wondered whether he was not mocking me, or whether he had not suddenly gone out of his senses. But I saw that he had never been less inclined to laugh, and the brightness of his keenly intelligent eyes assured me that he retained all his reason. Then, too, I was used to his broken way of talking, which only left me puzzled as to his meaning, till, with a very few clear, rapidly uttered words, he would make the drift of his ideas clear to me, and I saw that what he had previously said, and which had appeared to me void of meaning, was so thoroughly logical that I could not understand how it was I had not understood him sooner. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 4. In the Bosom of Wild Nature. The Château du Glandier is one of the oldest châteaux in the Île-de-France, where so many building remains of the feudal period are still standing. Built originally in the heart of the forest, in the reign of Philippe le Bel, it now could be seen a few hundred yards from the road leading from the village of Sainte-Geneviève to Montlhéry. A mass of inharmonious structures, it is dominated by a donjon. When the visitor has mounted the crumbling steps of this ancient donjon, he reaches a little plateau where, in the 17th century, Georges Philibert de Saint-Quigny, lord of the Glandier, Maisonneuve, and other places, built the existing town in an abominably rococo style of architecture. It was in this place, seemingly belonging entirely to the past, that Professor Stangerson and his daughter installed themselves, to lay the foundations for the science of the future. Its solitude in the depths of the woods was what, more than all, had pleased them. They would have none to witness their labors and intrude on their hopes, but the aged stones and grand old oaks. The Glandier, ancient Glandierum, was so called from the quantity of glands, acorns, which, in all times, had been gathered in that neighborhood. This land, of present mournful interest, had fallen back, owing to the negligence or abandonment of its owners, into the wild character of primitive nature. The buildings alone, which were hidden there, had preserved traces of their strange metamorphoses. Every age had left on them its imprint, a bit of architecture with which was bound up the remembrance of some terrible event, some bloody adventure. Such was the château in which science had taken refuge, a place seemingly designed to be the theatre of mysteries, terror, and death. Having explained so far, I cannot refrain from making one further reflection. If I have lingered a little over this description of the Glandier, it is not because I have reached the right moment for creating the necessary atmosphere for the unfolding of the tragedy before the eyes of the reader. Indeed, in all this matter, my first care will be to be as simple as is possible. I have no ambition to be an author. An author is always something of a romancer, and God knows the mystery of the Yellow Room is quite full enough of real tragic horror, to require no aid from literary effects. I am, and only desire to be, a faithful reporter. My duty is to report the event, and I place the event in its frame, that is all. It is only natural that you should know where the things happened. I return to Monsieur Stangerson. When he bought the estate, 15 years before the tragedy with which we are engaged occurred, the Château de Glandier had for a long time been unoccupied. Another old château in the neighborhood, built in the 14th century by Jean de Belmont, was also abandoned, so that that part of the country was very little inhabited. Some small houses on the side of the road leading to Corbeil, an inn called the Auberge de Donjon, which offered passing hospitality to wagoners, these were about all to represent civilization in this out-of-the-way part of the country. but a few leagues from the capital. But this deserted condition of the place had been the determining reason for the choice made by Monsieur Stangerson and his daughter. Monsieur Stangerson was already celebrated. He had returned from America, where his works had made a great stir. The book which he had published at Philadelphia on the dissociation of matter by electric action had aroused opposition throughout the whole scientific world. Monsieur Stangerson was a Frenchman, but of American origin. Important matters relating to a legacy had kept him for several years in the United States, where he had continued the work begun by him in France, whither he had returned in possession of a large fortune. This fortune was a great boon to him, for though he might have made millions of dollars by exploiting 2 or 3 of his chemical discoveries relative to new processes of dyeing, it was always repugnant to him to use for his own private gain the wonderful gift of invention he had received from nature. He considered he owed it to mankind, and all that his genius brought into the world went, by this philosophical view of his duty, into the public lap. If he did not try to conceal his satisfaction at coming into possession of this fortune, which enabled him to give himself up to his passion for pure science, he had equally to rejoice, it seemed to him, for another cause. Mademoiselle Stangerson was, at the time when her father returned from America and bought the Glandier estate, 20 years of age. She was exceedingly pretty, having at once the Parisian grace of her mother, who had died in giving her birth, and all the splendor, all the riches of the young American blood of her paternal grandfather, William Stangerson. A citizen of Philadelphia, William Stangerson had been obliged to become naturalized in obedience to family exigencies at the time of his marriage with a French lady, she who was to be the mother of the illustrious Stangerson. In that way the professor's French nationality is accounted for. 20 years of age, a charming blonde with blue eyes, milk-white complexion, and radiant with divine health, Mathilde Stangerson was one of the most beautiful, marriageable girls in either the Old or the New World. It was her father's duty, in spite of the inevitable pain which a separation from her would cause him, to think of her marriage, and he was fully prepared for it. Nevertheless, he buried himself and his child at the Glandier at the moment when his friends were expecting him to bring her out into society. Some of them expressed their astonishment, and to their questions he answered, "It is my daughter's wish. I can refuse her nothing. She has chosen the Glandier." Interrogated in her turn, the young girl replied calmly, "Where could we work better than in this solitude?" For Mademoiselle Stangerson had already begun to collaborate with her father in his work. It could not at the time be imagined that her passion for science would lead her so far as to refuse all the suitors who presented themselves to her for over 15 years. So secluded was the life led by the two, father and daughter, that they showed themselves only at a few official receptions and, at certain times in the year, in 2 or 3 friendly drawing-rooms, where the fame of the professor and the beauty of Mathilde made a sensation. The young girl's extreme reserve did not at first discourage suitors, but at the end of a few years they tired of their quest. One alone persisted with tender tenacity and deserved the name of eternal fiancé, a name he accepted with melancholy resignation. That was Monsieur Robert Darzac. Mademoiselle Stangerson was now no longer young, and it seemed that, having found no reason for marrying at 35, she would never find one. But such an argument evidently found no acceptance with Monsieur Robert Darzac. He continued to pay his court, if the delicate and tender attention with which he ceaselessly surrounded this woman of 35 could be called courtship, in face of her declared intention never to marry. Suddenly, some weeks before the events with which we are occupied, a report, to which nobody attached any importance, so incredible did it sound, was spread about Paris, that Mademoiselle Stangerson had at last consented to crown the inexhaustible flame of Monsieur Robert Darzac. It needed that Monsieur Robert Darzac himself should not deny this matrimonial rumor to give it an appearance of truth, so unlikely did it seem to be well founded. One day, however, Monsieur Stangerson, as he was leaving the Academy of Science, announced that the marriage of his daughter and Monsieur Robert Darzac would be celebrated in the privacy of the Château de Glandier, as soon as he and his daughter had put the finishing touches to their report, summing up their labors on the dissociation of matter. The new household would install itself in the Glandier, and the son-in-law would lend his assistance in the work to which the father and daughter had dedicated their lives. The scientific world had barely had time to recover from the effect of this news when it learned of the attempted assassination of Mademoiselle under the extraordinary conditions which we have detailed, and which our visit to the château was to enable us to ascertain with yet greater precision. I have not hesitated to furnish the reader with all these retrospective details, known to me through my business relations with Monsieur Robert Darzac. On crossing the threshold of the Yellow Room, he was as well posted as I was. End of Chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stuart Bell. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 5, in which Joseph Rouletabille makes a remark to Monsieur Robert Darzac which produces its little effect. Rouletabille and I had been walking for several minutes by the side of a long wall bounding the vast property of Monsieur Stangerson, and had already come within sight of the entrance gate when our attention was drawn to an individual who, half bent to the ground, seemed to be so completely absorbed in what he was doing as not to have seen us coming towards him. At one time he stooped so low as almost to touch the ground. At another he drew himself up and attentively examined the wall. Then he looked into the palm of one of his hands and walked away with rapid strides. Finally he set off running, still looking into the palm of his hand. Rouletabille had brought me to a standstill by a gesture. "Hush! Frederic Larsan is at work. Don't let us disturb him." Rouletabille had a great admiration for the celebrated detective. I had never before seen him, but I knew him well by reputation. At that time, before Rouletabille had given proof of his unique talent, Larsan was reputed as the most skilful unraveller of the most mysterious and complicated crimes. His reputation was worldwide, and the police of London and even of America often called him in to their aid when their own national inspectors and detectives found themselves at the end of their wits and resources. No one was astonished, then, that the head of the Sûreté had, at the outset of the mystery of the Yellow Room, telegraphed his precious subordinate to London, where he had been sent in a big case of stolen securities, to return with all haste. Frederic, who at the Sûreté was called the Great Frederic, had made all speed, doubtless knowing by experience that, if he was interrupted in what he was doing, it was because his services were urgently needed in another direction. So, as Rouletabille said, he was that morning already at work. We soon found out in what it consisted. What he was continually looking at in the palm of his right hand was nothing but his watch, the minute hand of which he appeared to be noting intently. Then he turned back, still running, stopping only when he reached the park gate, where he again consulted his watch, and then put it away in his pocket, shrugging his shoulders with a gesture of discouragement. He pushed open the park gate, reclosed and locked it, raised his head, and through the bars perceived us. Rouletabille rushed after him, and I followed. Frederic Larsan waited for us. "Monsieur Fred," said Rouletabille, raising his hat and showing the profound respect based on admiration which the young reporter felt for the celebrated detective, "can you tell me whether Monsieur Robert Darzac is at the chateau at this moment? Here is one of his friends of the Paris bar who desires to speak with him." "I really don't know, Monsieur Rouletabille," replied Fred, shaking hands with my friend, whom he had several times met in the course of his difficult investigations. "I have not seen him." "The concierges will be able to inform us, no doubt," said Rouletabille, pointing to the lodge, the door and windows of which were close shut. "The concierges will not be able to give you any information, Monsieur Rouletabille." "Why not?" Because they were arrested half an hour ago. Arrested? Cried Rouletabille. Then they are the murderers. Frederic Larsan shrugged his shoulders. When you can't arrest the real murderer, he said with an air of supreme irony, you can always indulge in the luxury of discovering accomplices. Did you have them arrested, Monsieur Fred? Not I. I haven't had them arrested. In the first place, I am pretty sure that they have not had anything to do with the affair, and then because... Because of what? Asked Rouletabille eagerly. Because of nothing, said Larsan, shaking his head. Because there were no accomplices, said Rouletabille. Aha! You have an idea, then, about this matter, said Larsan, looking at Rouletabille intently. Yet you have seen nothing, young man. You have not yet gained admission here. I shall get admission. I doubt it. The orders are strict. I shall gain admission if you let me see Monsieur Robert Darzac. Do that for me. You know we're old friends. I beg of you, Monsieur Fred. Do you remember the article I wrote about you on the gold bar case? The face of Rouletabille at the moment was really funny to look at. It showed such an irresistible desire to cross the threshold beyond which some prodigious mystery had occurred. It appealed with so much eloquence, not only of the mouth and eyes, but with all its features, that I could not refrain from bursting into laughter. Frederic Larsan, no more than myself, could retain his gravity. Meanwhile, standing on the other side of the gate, he calmly put the key in his pocket. I closely scrutinized him. He might be about 50 years of age. He had a fine head, his hair turning grey, a colourless complexion, and a firm profile. His forehead was prominent, his chin and cheeks clean-shaven. His upper lip, without moustache, was finely chiselled. His eyes were rather small and round, with a look in them that was at once searching and disquieting. He was of middle height and well built, with a general bearing elegant and gentlemanly. There was nothing about him of the vulgar policeman. In his way, he was an artist, and one felt that he had a high opinion of himself. The sceptical tone of his conversation was that of a man who had been taught by experience. His strange profession had brought him into contact with so many crimes and villainies that it would have been remarkable if his nature had not been a little hardened. Larsan turned his head at the sound of a vehicle which had come from the chateau and reached the gate behind him. We recognized the cab which had conveyed the examining magistrate and his registrar from the station at Epinay. Ah, said Frederic Larsan, if you want to speak with Monsieur Robert Darzac, he is here. The cab was already at the park gate, and Robert Darzac was begging Frederic Larsan to open it for him, explaining that he was pressed for time to catch the next train leaving Epinay for Paris. Then he recognized me. While Larsan was unlocking the gate, Monsieur Darzac inquired what had brought me to the Glandier at such a tragic moment. I noticed that he was frightfully pale, and that his face was lined as if from the effects of some terrible suffering. "Is Mademoiselle getting better?" I immediately asked. "Yes," he said. "She will be saved, perhaps. She must be saved." He did not add, "or it will be my death," but I felt that the phrase trembled on his pale lips. Rouletabille intervened. "You are in a hurry, monsieur, but I must speak with you. I have something of the greatest importance to tell you." Frederic Larsan interrupted. "May I leave you?" he asked of Robert Darzac. "Have you a key, or do you wish me to give you this one?" "Thank you. I have a key, and will lock the gate." Larsan hurried off in the direction of the chateau, the imposing pile of which could be perceived a few hundred yards away. Robert Darzac, with knit brow, was beginning to show impatience. I presented Rouletabille as a good friend of mine, but as soon as he learnt that the young man was a journalist, he looked at me very reproachfully, excused himself under the necessity of having to reach Epinay in 20 minutes, bowed, and whipped up his horse. But Rouletabille had seized the bridle, and to my utter astonishment, stopped the carriage with a vigorous hand. Then he gave utterance to a sentence which was utterly meaningless to me. "The presbytery has lost nothing of its charm, nor the garden its brightness." The words had no sooner left the lips of Rouletabille than I saw Robert Darzac quail. Pale as he was, he became paler. His eyes were fixed on the young man in terror, and he immediately descended from the vehicle in an inexpressible state of agitation. Come in," he stammered. Then, suddenly, and with a sort of fury, he repeated, "Let us go, monsieur." He turned up by the road he had come from the chateau, Rouletabille still retaining his hold on the horse's bridle. I addressed a few words to Monsieur Darzac, but he made no answer. My looks questioned Rouletabille, but his gaze was elsewhere. End of chapter 5. Recording by Stuart Bell, Cambridge, UK.
Chapter 6 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 6. In the Heart of the Oak Grove. We reached the chateau, and, as we approached it, saw 4 gendarmes pacing in front of a little door in the ground floor of the donjon. We soon learned that in this ground floor, which had formerly served as a prison, Monsieur and Madame Bernier, the concierges, were confined. Monsieur Robert Darzac led us into the modern part of the chateau by a large door, protected by a projecting awning, a marquise, as it is called. Rouletabille, who had resigned the horse and the cab to the care of the servant, never took his eyes off Monsieur Darzac. I followed his look, and perceived that it was directed solely towards the gloved hands of the Sorbonne professor. When we were in a tiny sitting-room fitted with old furniture, Monsieur Darzac turned to Rouletabille and said sharply, "What do you want?" The reporter answered, in an equally sharp tone, "To shake you by the hand." Darzac shrank back. What does that mean? Evidently he understood. What I also understood, that my friend suspected him of the abominable attempt on the life of Mademoiselle Stangerson. The impression of the blood-stained hand on the walls of the Yellow Room was in his mind. I looked at the man closely. His haughty face, with its expression ordinarily so straightforward, was at this moment strangely troubled. He held out his right hand, and referring to me, said, "As you are a friend of Monsieur Sainclair, who has rendered me invaluable services in a just cause, monsieur, I see no reason for refusing you my hand." Rouletabille did not take the extended hand. Lying with the utmost audacity, he said, "Monsieur, I have lived several years in Russia, where I have acquired the habit of never taking any but an ungloved hand." I thought that the Sorbonne professor would express his anger openly, but on the contrary, by a visibly violent effort, he calmed himself, took off his gloves, and showed his hands. They were unmarked by any cicatrix. "Are you satisfied?" "No," replied Rouletabille. "My dear friend," he said, turning to me, "I am obliged to ask you to leave us alone for a moment." I bowed and retired, stupefied by what I had seen and heard. I could not understand why Monsieur Robert Darzac had not already shown the door to my impertinent, insulting, and stupid friend. I was angry myself with Rouletabille at that moment for his suspicions, which had led to this scene of the gloves. For some 20 minutes I walked about in front of the chateau, trying vainly to link together the different events of the day. What was in Rouletabille's mind? Was it possible that he thought Monsieur Robert Darzac to be the murderer? How could it be thought that this man, who was to have married Mademoiselle Stangerson in the course of a few days, had introduced himself into The Yellow Room to assassinate his fiancée. I could find no explanation as to how the murderer had been able to leave The Yellow Room, and so long as that mystery, which appeared to me so inexplicable, remained unexplained, I thought it was the duty of all of us to refrain from suspecting anybody. But then, that seemingly senseless phrase, "The presbytery has lost nothing of its charm, nor the garden its brightness," still rang in my ears. What did it mean? I was eager to rejoin Rouletabille and question him. At that moment the young man came out of the chateau in the company of Monsieur Robert Darzac, and, extraordinary to relate, I saw, at a glance, that they were the best of friends. "We are going to The Yellow Room. Come with us," Rouletabille said to me. "You know, my dear boy, I am going to keep you with me all day. We'll breakfast together somewhere about here." "You'll breakfast with me here, gentlemen?" "No, thanks," replied the young man. "We shall breakfast at the Donjon Inn." "You'll fare very badly there. You'll not find anything." "Do you think so? Well, I hope to find something there," replied Rouletabille. "After breakfast we'll set to work again. I'll write my article, and if you'll be so good as to take it to the office for me—" "Won't you come back with me to Paris?" "No, I shall remain here." I turned towards Rouletabille. He spoke quite seriously, and Monsieur Robert Darzac did not appear to be in the least degree surprised. We were passing by the donjon and heard wailing voices. Rouletabille asked: "Why have these people been arrested?" "It is a little my fault," said Monsieur Darzac. "I happened to remark to the examining magistrate yesterday that it was inexplicable that the concierges had had time to hear the revolver shots, to dress themselves, and to cover so great a distance as that which lies between their lodge and the pavilion, in the space of 2 minutes, for not more than that interval of time had elapsed after the firing of the shots when they were met by Daddy Jacques." "That was suspicious, evidently," acquiesced Rouletabille. "And were they dressed?" "That is what is so incredible. They were dressed, completely, not one part of their costume wanting. The woman wore sabots, but the man had unlaced boots. Now they assert that they went to bed at 9:30. On arriving this morning, the examining magistrate brought with him from Paris a revolver of the same caliber as that found in the room, for he couldn't use the one held for evidence, and made his register fire 2 shots in The Yellow Room while the doors and windows were closed. We were with him in the lodge of the concierges, and yet we heard nothing, not a sound. The concierges have lied, of that there can be no doubt. They must have been already waiting, not far from the pavilion, waiting for something. Certainly they are not to be accused of being the authors of the crime, but their complicity is not improbable. That was why Monsieur de Marquet had them arrested at once." "If they had been accomplices," said Rouletabille, "they would not have been there at all. When people throw themselves into the arms of justice with the proofs of complicity on them, you can be sure they are not accomplices. I don't believe there are any accomplices in this affair." "Then why were they abroad at midnight? Why don't they say?" "They have certainly some reason for their silence. What that reason is has to be found out, for even if they are not accomplices, it may be of importance. Everything that took place on such a night is important." We had crossed an old bridge thrown over the Douve, and were entering the part of the park called the Oak Grove. The oaks here were centuries old. Autumn had already shriveled their tawny leaves, and their high branches, black and contorted, looked like horrid heads of hair, mingled with quaint reptiles such as the ancient sculptors might have made of the head of Medusa. This place, which Mademoiselle found cheerful, and in which she lived in the summer season, appeared to us as sad and funereal now. The soil was black and muddy from the recent rains and the rotting of the fallen leaves. The trunks of the trees were black, and the sky above us was now, as if in mourning, charged with great heavy clouds. And it was in this sombre and desolate retreat that we saw the white walls of the pavilion as we approached, a queer-looking building without a window visible on the side by which we neared it. A little door alone marked the entrance to it. It might have passed for a tomb, a vast mausoleum in the midst of a thick forest. As we came nearer, we were able to make out its disposition. The building obtained all the light it needed from the south, that is to say, from the open country. The little door closed on the park. Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson must have found it an ideal seclusion for their work and their dreams. The pavilion had a ground floor, which was reached by a few steps, and above it was an attic, with which we need not concern ourselves. Rouletabille had drawn a plan of the building, showing The Yellow Room, with its one window and its one door opening into the laboratory; the laboratory, with its two large barred windows and its doors, one serving for the vestibule, the other for The Yellow Room; the vestibule, with its unbarred window and door opening into the park; the lavatory, the stairs leading to the attic, and the large and only chimney in the pavilion, serving for the experiments of the laboratory. I assured myself that there was not a line in this plan that was wanting to help to the solution of the problem then set before the police. Thus my readers will know as much as Rouletabille knew when he entered the pavilion for the first time. With him, they may now ask, how did the murderer escape from The Yellow Room? Before mounting the 3 steps leading up to the door of the pavilion, Rouletabille stopped and asked Monsieur Darzac point-blank, "What was the motive for the crime?" "Speaking for myself, monsieur, there can be no doubt on the matter," said Mademoiselle Stangerson's fiancé, greatly distressed. "The nails of the fingers, the deep scratches on the chest and throat of Mademoiselle Stangerson showed that the wretch who attacked her attempted to commit a frightful crime. The medical expert who examined these traces yesterday affirmed that they were made by the same hand as that which left its imprint on the wall. An enormous hand, monsieur, much too large to go into my glove," he added, with an indefinable smile. "Could not that blood-stained hand," I interrupted, "have been the hand of Mademoiselle Stangerson, who, in the moment of falling, had pressed it against the wall, and, in slipping, enlarged the impression?" "There was not a drop of blood on either of her hands when she was lifted up," replied Monsieur Darzac. "We are now sure," said I, "that it was Mademoiselle Stangerson who was armed with Daddy Jacques' revolver, since she wounded the hand of the murderer. She was in fear, then, of somebody or something." "Probably." "Do you suspect anybody?" "No," replied Monsieur Darzac, looking at Rouletabille. Rouletabille then said to me, "You must know, my friend, that the inquiry is a little more advanced than Monsieur de Marquet has chosen to tell us. He not only knows that Mademoiselle Stangerson defended herself with the revolver, but he knows what the weapon was that was used to attack her. Monsieur Darzac tells me it was a mutton bone. Why is Monsieur de Marquet surrounding this mutton bone with so much mystery? No doubt for the purpose of facilitating the inquiries of the agents of the Sûreté. He imagines, perhaps, that the owner of this instrument of crime, the most terrible invented, is going to be found amongst those who are well known in the slums of Paris who use it. But who can ever say what passes through the brain of an examining magistrate?" Rouletabille added, with contemptuous irony, "Has a mutton bone been found in The Yellow Room?" I asked him. "Yes, monsieur. said Robert Darzac, "at the foot of the bed. But I beg of you not to say anything about it." I made a gesture of assent. It was an enormous mutton bone, the top of which, or rather the joint, was still red with the blood of the frightful wound. It was an old bone, which may, according to appearances, have served in other crimes. That's what Monsieur de Marquet thinks. He has had it sent to the municipal laboratory at Paris to be analysed. In fact, he thinks he has detected on it not only the blood of the last victim, but other stains of dried blood, evidences of previous crimes. A mutton bone in the hand of a skilled assassin is a frightful weapon, said Rouletabille. A more certain weapon than a heavy hammer. The scoundrel has proved it to be so, said Monsieur Robert Darzac, sadly. The joint of the bone found exactly fits the wound inflicted. My belief is that the wound would have been mortal, if the murderer's blow had not been arrested in the act by Mademoiselle Stangerson's revolver. Wounded in the hand, he dropped the mutton bone and fled. Unfortunately, the blow had been already given, and Mademoiselle was stunned after having been nearly strangled. If she had succeeded in wounding the man with the first shot of the revolver, she would, doubtless, have escaped the blow with the bone. But she had certainly employed her revolver too late. The first shot deviated and lodged in the ceiling. It was the second only that took effect. Having said this, Monsieur Darzac knocked at the door of the pavilion. I must confess to feeling a strong impatience to reach the spot where the crime had been committed. It was some time before the door was opened by a man whom I at once recognized as Daddy Jacques. He appeared to be well over 60 years of age. He had a long white beard and white hair, on which he wore a flat Basque cap. He was dressed in a complete suit of chestnut-colored velveteen, worn at the sides. Sabots were on his feet. He had rather a waspish-looking face, the expression of which lightened, however, as soon as he saw Monsieur Darzac. "Friends," said our guide. "Nobody in the pavilion, Daddy Jacques?" "I ought not to allow anybody to enter, Monsieur Robert, but of course the order does not apply to you. These gentlemen of justice have seen everything there is to be seen, and made enough drawings, and drawn up enough reports." "Excuse me, Daddy Jacques, one question before anything else," said Rouletabille. "What is it, young man, if I can answer it? Did your mistress wear her hair in bands that evening? You know what I mean, over her forehead?" "No, young man, my mistress never wore her hair in the way you suggest, neither on that day nor on any other. She had her hair drawn up, as usual, so that her beautiful forehead could be seen, pure as that of an unborn child." Rouletabille grunted, and set to work examining the door, finding that it fastened itself automatically. He satisfied himself that it could never remain open, and needed a key to open it. Then we entered the vestibule, a small, well-lit room paved with square red tiles. "Ah, this is the window by which the murderer escaped," said Rouletabille. "So they keep on saying, monsieur, so they keep on saying. But if he had gone off that way, we should have been sure to have seen him. We are not blind, neither Monsieur Stangerson nor me, nor the concierges who are in the prison. Why have they not put me in prison, too, on account of my revolver?" Rouletabille had already opened the window and was examining the shutters. "Were these closed at the time of the crime?" "And fastened with the iron catch inside," said Daddy Jacques, "and I am quite sure that the murderer did not get out that way." "Are there any bloodstains?" "Yes, on the stones outside. But blood of what?" "Ah!" said Rouletabille. "There are footmarks visible on the path. The ground was very moist. I will look into that presently." "Nonsense!" interrupted Daddy Jacques. The murderer did not go that way." "Which way did he go, then?" "How do I know?" Rouletabille looked at everything, smelled everything. He went down on his knees and rapidly examined every one of the paving tiles. Daddy Jacques went on: "Ah, you can't find anything, monsieur. Nothing has been found. And now it is all dirty. Too many persons have tramped over it. They wouldn't let me wash it, but on the day of the crime I had washed the floor thoroughly, and if the murderer had crossed it with his hobnailed boots, I should not have failed to see where he had been. He has left marks enough in Mademoiselle's chamber." Rouletabille rose. "When was the last time you washed these tiles?" he asked. And he fixed on Daddy Jacques a most searching look. "Why, as I told you, on the day of the crime, towards 5:30, while Mademoiselle and her father were taking a little walk before dinner, here in this room. They had dined in the laboratory. The next day, the examining magistrate came and saw all the marks there were on the floor, as plainly as if they had been made with ink on white paper. Well, neither in the laboratory nor in the vestibule, which were both as clean as a new pin, were there any traces of a man's footmarks. Since they have been found near this window outside, he must have made his way through the ceiling of The Yellow Room into the attic, then cut his way through the roof and dropped to the ground outside the vestibule window. But there's no hole, neither in the ceiling of The Yellow Room nor in the room of my attic. That is absolutely certain. So you see, we know nothing, nothing, and nothing will ever be known. It's a mystery of the devil's own making." Rouletabille went down upon his knees again, almost in front of a small lavatory at the back of the vestibule. In that position he remained for about a minute. "Well?" I asked him when he got up. "Oh, nothing very important. A drop of blood," he replied, turning towards Daddy Jacques as he spoke. "While you were washing the laboratory and this vestibule, was the vestibule window open?" he asked. "No, monsieur, it was closed. But after I had done washing the floor, I lit some charcoal for monsieur in the laboratory furnace, and as I lit it with old newspapers, it smoked, and so I opened both the windows in the laboratory and this one, to make a current of air. Then I shut those in the laboratory, and left this one open when I went out. When I returned to the pavilion, this window had been closed, and monsieur and mademoiselle were already at work in the laboratory. Monsieur or Mademoiselle Stangerson had no doubt shut it." "No doubt." "You did not ask them?" After a close scrutiny of the little lavatory and of the staircase leading up to the attic, Rouletabille, to whom we seemed no longer to exist, entered the laboratory. I followed him. It was, I confess, in a state of great excitement. Robert Darzac lost none of my friend's movements. As for me, my eyes were drawn at once to the door of The Yellow Room. It was closed, and, as I immediately saw, partially shattered and out of commission. My friend, who went about his work methodically, silently studied the room in which we were. It was large and well lighted. Two big windows, almost bays, were protected by strong iron bars, and looked out upon a wide extent of country. Through an opening in the forest, they commanded a wonderful view through the length of the valley and across the plain to the large town, which could be clearly seen in fair weather. To-day, however, a mist hung over the ground, and blood in that room! The whole of the side of the laboratory was taken up with a large chimney, crucibles, ovens, and such implements as are needed for chemical experiments. Tables, loaded with files, papers, reports, and electrical machine, an apparatus, as Monsieur Darzac informed me, employed by Professor Stangerson to demonstrate the dissociation of matter under the action of solar light, and other scientific implements. Along the walls were cabinets, plain or glass-fronted, through which were visible microscopes, special photographic apparatus, and a large quantity of crystals. Rouletabille, who was ferreting in the chimney, put his fingers into one of the crucibles. Suddenly he drew himself up and held up a piece of half-consumed paper in his hand. He stepped up to where we were talking by one of the windows. "Keep that for us, Monsieur Darzac," he said. I bent over the piece of scorched paper which Monsieur Darzac took from the hand of Rouletabille, and read distinctly the only words that remained legible: "Presbytery lost nothing, charm, nor the gars, its brightness." Twice since the morning these same meaningless words had struck me, and for the second time I saw that they produced on the Sorbonne professor the same paralyzing effect. Monsieur Darzac's first anxiety showed itself when he turned his eyes in the direction of Daddy Jacques, but, occupied as he was at another window, he had seen nothing. Then, trembling, opening his pocket-book, he put the piece of paper into it, sighing, "My God!" During this time Rouletabille had mounted into the opening of the fire-grate. That is to say, he had got upon the bricks of a furnace, and was attentively examining the chimney, which grew narrower towards the top, the outlet from it being closed with sheets of iron, fastened into the brickwork, through which passed 3 small chimneys. "Impossible to get out that way," he said, jumping back into the laboratory. "Besides, even if he had tried to do it, he would have brought all that ironwork down to the ground. No, no, it is not on that side we have to search." Rouletabille next examined the furniture, and opened the doors of the cabinet. Then he came to the windows, through which he declared no one could possibly have passed. At the second window he found Daddy Jacques in contemplation. "Well, Daddy Jacques," he said, "what are you looking at?" "That policeman who is always going round and round the lake. Another of those fellows who think they can see better than anybody else." "You don't know Frederic Larsan, Daddy Jacques, or you wouldn't speak of him in that way," said Rouletabille, in a melancholy tone. "If there is anyone who will find the murderer, it will be he." And Rouletabille heaved a deep sigh. "Before they find him, they will have to learn how they lost him," said Daddy Jacques, stolidly. At length we reached the door of The Yellow Room itself. "There is the door behind which some terrible scene took place," said Rouletabille, with a solemnity which, under any other circumstance, would have been comical. Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stuart Bell. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 7, in which Rouletabille sets out on an expedition under the bed. Rouletabille, having pushed open the door of the Yellow Room, paused on the threshold, saying with an emotion which I only later understood, "Ah, the perfume of the lady in black." The chamber was dark. Daddy Jacques was about to open the blinds when Rouletabille stopped him. "Did not the tragedy take place in complete darkness?" he asked. "No, young man, I don't think so. Mademoiselle always had a night light on her table, and I lit it every evening before she went to bed. I was a sort of chambermaid, you must understand, when the evening came. The real chambermaid did not come in here much before the morning. Mademoiselle worked late, far into the night. Where did the table with the night-light stand? Far from the bed? Some way from the bed. Can you light the burner now? The lamp is broken, and the oil that was in it was spilled when the table was upset. All the rest of the things in the room remain just as they were. I have only to open the blinds for you to see. Wait!" Rouletabille went back into the laboratory, closed the shutters of the 2 windows and the door of the vestibule. When we were in complete darkness, he lit a wax vesta and asked Daddy Jacques to move to the middle of the chamber with it, to the place where the night-light was burning that night. Daddy Jacques, who was in his stockings, he usually left his sabot in the vestibule, entered the yellow room with his bit of a vesta. We vaguely distinguished objects overthrown on the floor, a bed in one corner, and, in front of us, to the left, the gleam of a looking-glass hanging on the wall near to the bed. "That will do. You may now open the blinds," said Rouletabille. "Don't come any further," Daddy Jacques begged. "You may make marks with your boots, and nothing must be deranged. It's an idea of the magistrate's, though he has nothing more to do here." And he pushed open the shutter. The pale daylight entered from without, throwing a sinister light on the saffron-coloured walls. The floor, for though the laboratory and the vestibule were tiled, the yellow room had a flooring of wood, was covered with a single yellow mat, which was large enough to cover nearly the whole room, under the bed and under the dressing-table, the only piece of furniture that remained upright. The centre round table, the night-table, and 2 chairs had been overturned. These did not prevent a large stain of blood being visible on the mat, made, as Daddy Jacques informed us, by the blood which had flowed from the wound on Mademoiselle Stangerson's forehead. Besides these stains, drops of blood had fallen in all directions, in line with the visible traces of the footsteps, large and black, of the murderer. Everything led to the presumption that these drops of blood had fallen from the wound of the man who had, for a moment, placed his red hand on the wall. There were other traces of the same hand on the wall, but much less distinct. See this blood on the wall!" I could not help exclaiming. "The man who pressed his hand so heavily upon it in the darkness must certainly have thought that he was pushing at a door. That's why he pressed on it so hard, leaving on the yellow paper the terrible evidence. I don't think there are many hands in the world of that sort. It's big and strong, and the fingers are nearly all one as long as the other. The thumb is wanting, and we only have the mark of the palm. But if we follow the trace of the hand," I continued, "we see that, after leaving its imprint in the wall, the touch sought the door, found it, and then felt for the lock." "No doubt," interrupted Rouletabille, chuckling, "only there is no blood, either on the lock or on the bolt." "What does that prove?" I rejoined, with a good sense of which I was proud. "He might have opened the lock with his left hand, which would have been quite natural, his right hand being wounded." "He didn't open it at all," Daddy Jacques again exclaimed. "We are not fools, and there were 4 of us when we burst open the door." "What a queer hand! Look what a queer hand it is!" I said. "It is a very natural hand," said Rouletabille, "of which the shape has been deformed by its having slipped on the wall. The man dried his hand on the wall. He must be a man about 5'8" in height." "How do you come at that?" "By the height of the marks on the wall." My friend next occupied himself with the mark of the bullet in the wall. It was a round hole. "This ball was fired straight, not from above, and consequently not from below." Rouletabille went back to the door and carefully examined the lock and the bolt, satisfying himself that the door had certainly been burst open from the outside, and further that the key had been found in the lock on the inside of the chamber. He finally satisfied himself that, with the key in the lock, the door could not possibly be opened from without with another key. Having made sure of all these details, he let fall these words: "That's better." Then, sitting down on the ground, he hastily took off his boots, and in his socks went into the room. The first thing he did was to examine minutely the overturned furniture. We watched him in silence. "Young fellow, you are giving yourself a great deal of trouble," said Daddy Jacques ironically. Rouletabille raised his head and said, "You have spoken the simple truth, Daddy Jacques. Your mistress did not have her hair in bands that evening. I was a donkey to have believed she did." Then, with the suppleness of a serpent, he slipped under the bed. Presently we heard him ask, "At what time, Monsieur Jacques, did Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson arrive at the laboratory?" "At 6 o'clock." The voice of Rouletabille continued, "Yes, he's been under here, that's certain. In fact, there was nowhere else where he could have hidden himself. Here, too, are the marks of his hobnails. When you entered, all four of you, did you look under the bed?" "At once. We drew it right out of its place. And between the mattresses?" "There was only one on the bed, and on that Mademoiselle was placed, and Monsieur Stangerson and the concierge immediately carried it into the laboratory. Under the mattress there was nothing but the metal netting, which could not conceal anything or anybody. Remember, monsieur, that there were four of us, and we couldn't fail to see everything. The chamber is so small and scantily furnished, and all was locked behind in the pavilion." I ventured an hypothesis. "Perhaps he got away with the mattress, in the mattress. Anything is possible in the face of such a mystery. In their distress of mind, Monsieur Stangerson and the concierge may not have noticed that they were bearing a double weight, especially if the concierge were an accomplice. I throw out this hypothesis for what it's worth, but it explains many things, and particularly the fact that neither the laboratory nor the vestibule bear any traces of the footmarks found in the room. If, in carrying Mademoiselle on the mattress from the laboratory of the chateau, they rested for a moment, then there might have been an opportunity for the man in it to escape." "And then?" asked Rouletabille, deliberately laughing under the bed. I felt rather vexed, and replied, "Well, I don't know, but anything appears possible." "The examining magistrate had the same idea, monsieur," said Daddy Jacques, "and he carefully examined the mattress. He was obliged to laugh at the idea, monsieur, as your friend is doing now, for who ever heard of a mattress having a double bottom?" I was myself obliged to laugh, on seeing that what I had said was absurd. But in an affair like this, one hardly knows where an absurdity begins or ends. My friend alone seemed able to talk intelligently. He called out from under the bed, "The mat here has been moved out of place. Who did it?" "We did, monsieur," explained Daddy Jacques. "When we could not find the assassin, we asked ourselves whether there was not some hole in the floor." "There is not," replied Rouletabille. "Is there a cellar?" "No, there's no cellar, but that has not stopped our searching, and has not prevented the examining magistrate and his registrar from studying the floor plank by plank, as if there had been a cellar under it." The reporter then reappeared. His eyes were sparkling, and his nostrils quivered. He remained on his hands and knees. He could not be better likened than to an admirable sporting dog on the scent of some unusual game. And indeed he was scenting the steps of a man, the man whom he had sworn to report to his master, the manager of the Epoque. It must not be forgotten that Rouletabille was first and last a journalist. Thus, on his hands and knees, he made his way to the four corners of the room, so to speak, sniffing and going around everything that we could see, which was not much, and everything that we could not see, which must have been infinite. The toilette table was a simple table standing on four legs. There was nothing about it by which it could possibly be changed into a temporary hiding place. There was not a closet or cupboard. Mademoiselle Stangerson kept her wardrobe at the chateau. Rouletabille literally passed his nose and hands along the walls, constructed of solid brickwork. When he had finished with the walls, and passed his agile fingers over every portion of the yellow paper covering them, he reached to the ceiling, which he was able to touch by mounting on a chair placed on the toilette table, and by moving this ingeniously constructed stage from place to place, he examined every foot of it. When he had finished his scrutiny of the ceiling, where he carefully examined the hole made by the second bullet, he approached the window, and once more examined the iron bars and blinds, all of which were solid and intact. At last he gave a grunt of satisfaction and declared, "Now I am at ease." "Well, do you believe that the poor dear young lady was shut up when she was being murdered, when she cried out for help?" wailed Daddy Jacques. "Yes," said the young reporter, drying his forehead. "The Yellow Room was as tightly shut as an iron safe." "That," I said, "is why this mystery is the most surprising I know. Edgar Allan Poe, in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, invented nothing like it. The place of that crime was sufficiently closed to prevent the escape of a man, but there was that window through which the monkey, the perpetrator of the murder, could slip away. But here there can be no question of an opening of any sort. The door was fastened, and through the window blinds, secure as they were, not even a fly could enter or get out." "True, true," assented Rouletabille, as he kept on drying his forehead, which seemed to be perspiring less from his recent bodily exertion than from his mental agitation. "Indeed, it's a beautiful and a very curious mystery." "The Bête de Bon Dieu," muttered Daddy Jacques. "The Bête de Bon Dieu herself, if she had committed the crime, could not have escaped. Listen! Do you hear it? Hush!" Daddy Jacques made us a sign to keep quiet, and, stretching his arm towards the wall nearest the forest, listened to something which we could not hear. "It's answering," he said at length. "I must kill it. It is too wicked, but it's the Bête de Bon Dieu, and every night it goes to pray on the tomb of Sainte Geneviève, and nobody dares to touch her, for fear that Mother Angenoux should cast an evil spell on them." "How big is the Bête de Bon Dieu?" "Nearly as big as a small retriever. A monster, I tell you. Ah, I have asked myself more than once whether it was not her that took out our poor mademoiselle by the throat with her claws. But the Bête de Bon Dieu does not wear hobnailed boots, nor fire revolvers, nor has she a hand like that," exclaimed Daddy Jacques, again pointing out to us the red mark on the wall. "Besides, we should have seen her as well as we would have seen a man." Evidently, I said, before we had seen this Yellow Room, I had also asked myself whether the cat of Mother Angenoux— "You also?" cried Rouletabille. "Didn't you?" I asked. "Not for a moment. After reading the article in the Matin, I knew that a cat had nothing to do with the matter. But I swear now that a frightful tragedy has been enacted here. You say nothing about the Basque cap or the handkerchief found here, Daddy Jacques?" "Of course the magistrate has taken them," the old man answered, hesitatingly. "I haven't seen either the handkerchief or the cap, yet I can tell you how they are made," the reporter said to him gravely. "Oh, you are very clever," said Daddy Jacques, coughing and embarrassed. "The handkerchief is a large one, blue with red stripes, and the cap is an old Basque cap like the one you're wearing now." "You are quite a wizard," said Daddy Jacques, trying not to laugh and not quite succeeding. "How do you know that the handkerchief is blue with red stripes?" "Because if it had not been blue with red stripes, it would not have been found at all." Without giving any further attention to Daddy Jacques, my friend took a piece of paper from his pocket, and taking out a pair of scissors, bent over the footprints. Placing the paper over one of them, he began to cut. In a short time he had made a perfect pattern, which he handed to me, begging me not to lose it. He then returned to the window, and pointing to the figure of Frederic Larsan, who had not quitted the side of the lake, asked Daddy Jacques whether the detective had, like himself, been working in the Yellow Room. "No," replied Robert Darzac, who, since Rouletabille had handed him the piece of scorched paper, had not uttered a word. "He pretends that he does not need to examine the Yellow Room. He says that the murderer made his escape from it in quite a natural way, and that he will, this evening, explain how he did it." As he listened to what Monsieur Darzac had to say, Rouletabille turned pale. "Has Frederic Larsan found out the truth, which I can only guess at?" he murmured. "He is very clever, and I admire him. But what we have to do today is something more than the work of a policeman. something quite different from the teachings of experience. We have to take hold of our reason by the right end. The reporter rushed into the open air, agitated by the thought that the great and famous Fred might anticipate him in the solution of the problem of the Yellow Room. I managed to reach him on the threshold of the pavilion. "Calm yourself, my dear fellow," I said. "Aren't you satisfied?" "Yes," he confessed to me with a deep sigh. "I am quite satisfied. I have discovered many things." "Moral or material?" "Several moral, one material. This, for example." And rapidly he drew from his waistcoat pocket a piece of paper in which he had placed a light-coloured hair from a woman's head. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Stuart Bell, Cambridge, UK.
Chapter 8 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 8. The examining magistrate questions Mademoiselle Stangerson. 2 minutes later, as Rouletabille was bending over the footprints discovered in the park under the window of the vestibule, a man, evidently a servant at the chateau, came towards us rapidly and called out to Monsieur Darzac, then coming out of the pavilion. "Monsieur Robert, the magistrate, you know, is questioning mademoiselle." Monsieur Darzac added a muttered excuse to us and set off running toward the chateau, the man running after him. "If the corpse can speak," I said, "it would be interesting to be there." "We must know," said my friend. "Let's go to the chateau." And he drew me with him. But at the chateau a gendarme placed in the vestibule denied us admission up the staircase of the first floor. We were obliged to wait downstairs. This is what passed in the chamber of the victim while we were waiting below. The family doctor, finding that Mademoiselle Stangerson was much better, but fearing a relapse which would no longer permit of her being questioned, had thought it his duty to inform the examining magistrate of this, who decided to proceed immediately with a brief examination. At this examination the registrar, Monsieur Stangerson, and the doctor were present. Later I obtained the text of the report of the examination, and I give it here in all its legal dryness. Question. Are you able, mademoiselle, without too much fatiguing yourself, to give some necessary details of the frightful attack of which you have been the victim? Answer. I feel much better, monsieur, and I will tell you all I know. When I entered my chamber, I did not notice anything unusual there. Question. Excuse me, mademoiselle. If you will allow me, I will ask you some questions, and you will answer them. That will fatigue you less than making a long recital. Answer. Do so, monsieur. Question. What did you do on that day? I want you to be as minute and precise as possible. I wish to know all you did that day, if it is not asking too much of you. Answer. I rose late at 10 o'clock, for my father and I had returned home late on the night previously, having been to dinner at the reception given by the President of the Republic in honor of the Academy of Science of Philadelphia. When I left my chamber at 10:30, my father was already at work in the laboratory. We worked together till midday. We then took half an hour's walk in the park, as we were accustomed to do, before breakfasting at the chateau. After breakfast we took another walk for half an hour, and then returned to the laboratory. There we found my chambermaid, who had come to set my room in order. I went into the Yellow Room to give her some slight orders, and she directly afterwards left the pavilion, and I resumed my work with my father. At 5 o'clock we went again for a walk in the park, and afterward had tea. Question. Before leaving the pavilion at 5 o'clock, did you go into your chamber? Answer. No, monsieur. My father went into it at my request to bring my hat. Question. And he found nothing suspicious there? Answer. Evidently no, monsieur. Question. It is then almost certain that the murderer was not yet concealed under the bed. When you went out, was the door of the room locked? Answer. No, there was no reason for locking it. Question. You were absent from the pavilion some length of time, Monsieur Stangerson and you? Answer. About an hour. Question. It was during that hour, no doubt, that the murderer got into the pavilion. But how? Nobody knows. Footmarks have been found in the park, leading away from the window of the vestibule, but none has been found going towards it. Did you notice whether the vestibule window was open when you went out? Answer. No, monsieur, I don't remember. Monsieur Stangerson. It was closed. Question. And when you returned? Mademoiselle Stangerson. I did not notice. Monsieur Stangerson. It was still closed. I remember remarking aloud. Daddy Jacques must have opened it while we were away. Question. Strange. Do you recollect, Monsieur Stangerson, if during your absence and before going out he had opened it? You returned to the laboratory at 6 o'clock and resumed work? Mademoiselle Stangerson. Yes, monsieur. Question. And you did not leave the laboratory from that hour up until the moment when you entered your chamber? Monsieur Stangerson. Neither my daughter nor I, monsieur. We were engaged on work that was pressing, and we lost not a moment, neglecting everything else on that account. Question. Did you dine in the laboratory? Answer. For that reason. Question. Are you accustomed to dine in the laboratory? Answer. We rarely dine there. Question. Could the murderer have known that you would dine there that evening? Monsieur Stangerson. Good heavens, I think not. It was only when we returned to the pavilion at 6 o'clock that we decided, my daughter and I, to dine there. At that moment I was spoken to by my gamekeeper, who detained me a moment to ask me to accompany him on an urgent tour of inspection in a part of the woods which I had decided to thin. I put this off until the next day, and begged him, as he was going by the chateau, to tell the steward that we should dine in the laboratory. He left me to execute the errand, and I rejoined my daughter, who was already at work. Question. At what hour, mademoiselle, did you go to your chamber while your father continued to work there? Answer. At midnight. Question. Did Daddy Jacques enter the yellow room in the course of the evening? Answer. To shut the blinds and light the night light. Question. He saw nothing suspicious? Answer. He would have told us if he had seen. Daddy Jacques is an honest man and very attached to me. Question. You affirm, Monsieur Stangerson, that Daddy Jacques remained with you all the time you were in the laboratory? Monsieur Stangerson. I am sure of it. I have no doubt of that. Question. When you entered your chamber, mademoiselle, you immediately shut the door and locked and bolted it? That was taking unusual precautions, knowing that your father and your servant were there. Were you in fear of something then? Answer. My father would be returning to the chateau, and Daddy Jacques would be going to his bed, and in fact I did fear something. Question. You were so much in fear of something that you borrowed Daddy Jacques' revolver without telling him you had done so? Answer. That is true. I did not wish to alarm anybody, the more because my fears might have proved to be foolish. Question. What was it you feared? Answer. I hardly know how to tell you. For several nights I seemed to hear, both in the park and out of the park, round the pavilion, unusual sounds, sometimes footsteps, at other times the cracking of branches. The night before the attack on me, when I did not get to bed before 3 o'clock in the morning, on our return from the Elysee, I stood for a moment before my window, and I felt sure I saw shadows. Question. How many? Answer. 2. They moved around the lake. Then the moon became clouded, and I lost sight of them. At this time of the season, every year, I have generally returned to my apartment at the chateau for the winter. But this year I said to myself that I would not quit the pavilion before my father had finished the résumé of his works on the dissociation of matter for the Academy. I did not wish that that important work, which was to have been finished in the course of a few days, should be delayed by a change in our daily habit. You can well understand that I did not wish to speak of my childish fears to my father, nor did I say anything to Daddy Jacques, who I knew would not have been able to hold his tongue. Knowing that he had a revolver in his room, I took advantage of his absence and borrowed it, placing it on the drawer of my note-table. Question. You know of no enemies you have? Answer. None. Question. You understand, mademoiselle, that these precautions are calculated to cause surprise? Monsieur Stangerson. Evidently, my child, such precautions are very surprising. Answer. No, because I have told you that I had been uneasy for 2 nights. Monsieur Stangerson. You ought to have told me of that. This misfortune would have been avoided. Question. The door of the yellow room locked, did you go to bed? Answer. Yes, and being very tired, I at once went to sleep. Question. The night light was still burning? Answer. Yes, but it gave a very feeble light. Question. Then, mademoiselle, tell us what happened. Answer. I do not know whether I had been long asleep, but suddenly I awoke and uttered a loud cry. Monsieur Stangerson. Yes, a horrible cry, murder. It still rings in my ears. Question. You uttered a loud cry? Answer. A man was in my chamber. He sprang at me and tried to strangle me. I was nearly stifled when suddenly I was able to reach the drawer of my night-table and grasp the revolver which I had placed in it. At that moment the man had forced me to the foot of my bed and brandished in over my head a sort of mace, but I had fired. He immediately struck a terrible blow at my head. All that, monsieur, passed more rapidly than I can tell it, and I know nothing more. Question. Nothing? Have you no idea as to how the assassin could escape from your chamber? Answer. None whatever. I know nothing more. One does not know what is passing around one when one is unconscious. Question. Was the man you saw tall or short, little or big? Answer. I only saw a shadow, which appeared to me formidable. Question. You cannot give us any indication? Answer. I know nothing more, monsieur, than that a man threw himself upon me and that I fired at him. I know nothing more. Here the interrogation of Mademoiselle Stangerson concluded. Rouletabille waited patiently for Monsieur Robert Darzac, who soon appeared. From a room near the chamber of Mademoiselle Stangerson he had heard the interrogatory and now came to recount it to my friends with great exactitude, aided by an excellent memory. His docility still surprised me. Thanks to hasty pencil notes, he was able to reproduce, almost textually, the questions and answers given. It looked as if Monsieur Darzac was being employed as the secretary of my young friend, and acted as if he could refuse him nothing, nay, more, as if under a compulsion to do so. The fact of the closed window struck the reporter as it had struck the magistrate. Rouletabille asked Darzac to repeat once more Mademoiselle Stangerson's account of how she and her father had spent the day on the time of the tragedy, as she had stated it to the magistrate. The circumstance of the dinner in the laboratory seemed to interest him in the highest degree, and he had it repeated to him 3 times. He also wanted to be sure that the forest-keeper knew that the professor and his daughter were going to dine in the laboratory, and how he had come to know it. When Monsieur Darzac had finished, I said, "The examination has not advanced the problem much." "It has put it back," said Monsieur Darzac. "It has thrown light upon it," said Rouletabille thoughtfully. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Zablicki. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 9. Reporter and Detective. The three of us went back towards the pavilion. At some distance from the building, the reporter made us stop and, pointing to a small clump of trees to the right of us, said, "That's where the murderer came from to get into the pavilion." As there were other patches of trees of the same sort between the great oaks, I asked why the murderer had chosen that one, rather than any of the others. Rouletabille answered me by pointing to the path which ran quite close to the thicket to the door of the pavilion. "That path is, as you see, topped with gravel," he said. "The man must have passed along it going to the pavilion, since no traces of his steps have been found on the soft ground. The man didn't have wings, he walked, but he walked on the gravel, which left no impression of his tread. The gravel has, in fact, been trodden by many other feet, since the path is the most direct way between the pavilion and the chateau. As to the thicket, made of the sort of shrubs that don't flourish in the rough season, laurels and fuchsias, it offered the murderer a sufficient hiding place until it was time for him to make his way to the pavilion. It was while hiding in that clump of trees that he saw Monsieur and Mademoiselle Stangerson, and then Daddy Jacques, leave the pavilion. Gravel has been spread very nearly up to the window of the pavilion. The footprints of a man, parallel with the wall, marks which we will examine presently and which I have already seen, prove that he only needed to make one stride to find himself in front of the vestibule window, left open by Daddy Jacques. The man drew himself up by his hands and entered the vestibule. "After all, it is very possible," I said. "After all what? After all what?" cried Rouletabille. I begged of him not to be angry, but he was too much irritated to listen to me, and declared, ironically, that he admired the prudent doubt with which certain people approached the most simple problems, risking nothing by saying, "That is so," or "That is not so." Their intelligence would have produced about the same result if nature had forgotten to furnish their brain-pan with a little grey matter. As I appeared vexed, my young friend took me by the arm and admitted that he had not meant that for me. He thought more of me than that. "If I did not reason as I do in regard to this gravel," he went on, "I should have to assume a balloon. My dear fellow, the science of the aerostation of dirigible balloons is not yet developed enough for me to consider it, and suppose that a murderer would drop from the clouds. So don't say a thing is possible when it could not be otherwise. We know now how the man entered by the window, and we also know the moment at which he entered, during the 5 o'clock walk of the professor and his daughter. The fact of the presence of the chambermaid, who had come to clean up the Yellow Room, in the laboratory, when Monsieur Stangerson and his daughter returned from their walk at 1:30, permits us to affirm that at 1:30 the murderer was not in the chamber under the bed, unless he was in collusion with the chambermaid. What do you say, Monsieur Darzac? Monsieur Darzac shook his head, and said he was sure of the chambermaid's fidelity, and that she was a thoroughly honest and devoted servant. Besides, he added, at 5 o'clock Monsieur Stangerson went into the room to fetch his daughter's hat. There is that also, said Rouletabille. That the man entered by the window at the time you say, I admit, I said, but why did he shut the window? It was an act which would necessarily draw the attention of those who had left it open. It may be the window was not shut at once, replied the young reporter. But if he did shut the window, it was because of the bend in the gravel path, a dozen yards from the pavilion, and on account of the 3 oaks that are growing at that spot. What do you mean by that? Asked Monsieur Darzac, who had followed us and listened with almost breathless attention to all that Rouletabille had said. I'll explain all to you later, monsieur, when I think the moment to be ripe for doing so. But I don't think I have anything of more importance to say on this affair, if my hypothesis is justified. And what is your hypothesis? You will never know, if it does not turn out to be the truth. It is of much too grave a nature to speak of it, so long as it continues to be only a hypothesis. Have you at least some idea as to who the murderer is? No, monsieur, I don't know who the murderer is. But don't be afraid, Monsieur Robert Darzac. I shall know. I could not but observe that Monsieur Darzac was deeply moved, and I suspected that Rouletabille's confident assertion was not pleasing to him. Why, I asked myself, if he was really afraid that the murderer should be discovered, was he helping the reporter to find him? My young friend seemed to have received the same impression, for he said, bluntly, Monsieur Darzac, don't you want me to find out who the murderer was? Oh, I should like to kill him with my own hand, cried Mademoiselle Stangerson's fiancé, with a vehemence that amazed me. I believe you, said Rouletabille gravely, but you have not answered my question. We were passing by the thicket, of which the young reporter had spoken to us a minute before. I entered it and pointed out evident traces of a man who had been hidden there. Rouletabille, once more, was right. Yes, yes, he said. We have to do with a thing of flesh and blood who uses the same means that we do. It'll all come out on those lines. Having said this, he asked me for the paper pattern of the footprint which he had given me to take care of, and applied it to a very clear footmark behind the thicket. Aha, he said, rising. I thought he was now going to trace back the track of the murderer's footmarks to the vestibule window, but he led us instead far to the left, saying that it was useless ferreting in the mud, and that he was sure now of the road taken by the murderer. He went along the wall to the hedge and dry ditch, over which he jumped. See, just in front of the little path leading to the lake, that was his nearest way to get out. How do you know he went to the lake? Because Frederick Larsen has not quitted the borders of it since this morning. There must be some important marks there. A few minutes later, we reached the lake. It was a little sheet of marshy water, surrounded by reeds, on which floated some dead water-lily leaves. The great Fred may have seen us approaching, but we probably interested him very little, for he took hardly any notice of us, and continued to be stirring with his cane something which we could not see. Look, said Rouletabille, here again are the footmarks of the escaping man. They skirt the lake here, and finally disappear just before this path, which leads to the high road to Epinay. The man continued his flight to Paris. What makes you think that? I asked, since these footmarks are not continued on the path. What makes me think that? Why, these footprints, which I expected to find, he cried, pointing to the sharply outlined imprint of a neat boot. See! And he called to Frederick Larsen. Monsieur Fred, these neat footprints seem to have been made since the discovery of the crime. Yes, young man, yes, they have been carefully made, replied Fred, without raising his head. You see, there are steps that come, and steps that go back. And the man had a bicycle, cried the reporter. Here, after looking at the marks of the bicycle, which followed, going and coming, the neat footprints, I thought I might intervene. The bicycle explains the disappearance of the murderer's big footprints, I said. The murderer, with his rough boots, mounted a bicycle. His accomplice, the wearer of the neat boots, had come to wait for him on the edge of the lake with the bicycle. It might be supposed that the murderer was working for the other. No, no, replied Rouletabille with a strange smile. I have expected to find these footmarks from the very beginning. These are not the footmarks of the murderer. Then there were two. No, there was but one, and he had no accomplice. Very good, cried Frederick Larsen. Look, continued the young reporter, showing us the ground where it had been disturbed by the big and heavy heels. The man seated himself there, and took off his hobnailed boots, which he had worn only for the purpose of misleading detection, and then, no doubt, taking them away with him, he stood up in his own boots, and quietly and slowly regained the high road, holding his bicycle in his hand, for he could not venture to ride it on this rough path. That accounts for the lightness of the impression made by the wheels along it, in spite of the softness of the ground. If there had been a man on the bicycle, the wheels would have sunk deeply into the soil. No, there was but one man there, the murderer, on foot. Bravo, bravo, cried Fred again, and coming suddenly towards us, and planting himself in front of Monsieur Robert Darzac, he said to him, If we had a bicycle here, we might demonstrate the correctness of the young man's reasoning, Monsieur Robert Darzac. Do you know whether there's one at the chateau? No, replied Monsieur Darzac, there is not. I took mine 4 days ago to Paris, the last time I came to the chateau, before the crime. That's a pity, replied Fred very coldly. And then turning to Rouletabille, he said, If we go on at this rate, we'll both come to the same conclusion. Have you any idea as to how the murderer got away from the Yellow Room? Yes, said my young friend, I have an idea. So have I, said Fred, and it must be the same as yours. There are no two ways of reasoning in this affair. I am waiting for the arrival of my chief before offering any explanation to the examining magistrate. Ah, is the chief of the Sûreté coming? Yes, this afternoon. He is going to summon, before the magistrate, in the laboratory, all those who have played any part in this tragedy. It will be very interesting. It is a pity you won't be able to be present. I shall be present, said Rouletabille confidently. Really, you are an extraordinary fellow, for your age, replied the detective in a tone not wholly free from irony. You'd make a wonderful detective, if you had a little more method, if you didn't follow your instincts and that bump on your forehead. As I have already several times observed, Monsieur Rouletabille, you reason too much. You do not allow yourself to be guided by what you have seen. What do you say to the handkerchief full of blood, and the red mark of the hand on the wall? You have seen the stain on the wall, but I have only seen the handkerchief. Bah! Cried Rouletabille. The murderer was wounded in the hand by Mademoiselle Stangerson's revolver. Ah, a simply instinctive observation. Take care. You are becoming too strictly logical, Monsieur Rouletabille. Logic will upset you if you use it indiscriminately. You are right when you say that Mademoiselle Stangerson fired her revolver, but you are wrong when you say that she wounded the murderer in the hand. I am sure of it, cried Rouletabille. Fred, imperturbable, interrupted him. Defective observation, defective observation. The examination of the handkerchief, the numberless little round scarlet stains, the impression of drops which I found in the tracks of the footprints at the moment when they were made on the floor, proved to me that the murderer was not wounded at all. Monsieur Rouletabille, the murderer bled at the nose. The great Fred spoke quite seriously. However, I could not refrain from uttering an exclamation. The reporter looked gravely at Fred, who looked gravely at him. And Fred immediately concluded, the man allowed the blood to flow into his hand and handkerchief, and dried his hand on the wall. The fact is highly important, he added, because there is no need of his being wounded in the hand for him to be the murderer. Rouletabille seemed to be thinking deeply. After a moment, he said, There is something, Monsieur Frederick Larsan, much graver than the misuse of logic, the disposition of mind in some detectives which makes them, in perfect good faith, twist logic to the necessities of their preconceived ideas. You already have your idea about the murderer, Monsieur Fred. Don't deny it. And your theory demands that the murderer should not have been wounded in the hand. Otherwise, it comes to nothing. And you have searched and have found something else. It's dangerous, very dangerous, Monsieur Fred, to go from a preconceived idea to find the proofs to fit it. That method may leave you far astray. Beware of judicial error, Monsieur Fred. It will trip you up. And laughing a little, in a slightly bantering tone, his hands in his pockets, Rouletabille fixed his cunning eyes on the great Fred. Frederick Larsan silently contemplated the young reporter, who pretended to be as wise as himself. Shrugging his shoulders, he bowed to us and moved quickly away, hitting the stones on his path with his stout cane. Rouletabille watched his retreat and then turned towards us, his face joyous and triumphant. I shall beat him, he cried. I shall beat the great Fred, clever as he is. I shall beat them all. And he danced a double shuffle. Suddenly he stopped. My eyes followed his gaze. They were fixed on Monsieur Robert Darzac, who was looking anxiously at the impression left by his feet side by side with the elegant footmarks. There was not a particle of difference between them. We thought he was about to faint. His eyes, bulging with terror, avoided us, while his right hand, with a spasmodic movement, twitched at the beard that covered his honest, gentle, and now despairing face. At length, regaining his self-possession, he bowed to us, and remarking in a changed voice that he was obliged to return to the chateau, and left us. "The deuce!" exclaimed Rouletabille. He also appeared to be deeply concerned. From his pocket-book he took a piece of white paper, as I had seen him do before, and with his scissors cut out the shape of the neat boot marks that were on the ground. Then he fitted the new paper pattern with the one he had previously made. The two were exactly alike. Rising, Rouletabille exclaimed again, "The deuce!" Presently he added, "Yet I believe Monsieur Robert Darzac to be an honest man." He then led me on the road to the Donjon Inn, which we could see on the highway, by the side of a small clump of trees. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Mystery of the Yellow Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gloria Zablicki. The Mystery of the Yellow Room by Gaston Leroux. Chapter 10. We Shall Have to Eat Red Meat Now. The Donjon Inn was of no imposing appearance, but I liked these buildings with their rafters blackened with age and the smoke of their hearths, these inns of the coaching days, crumbling erections that will soon exist in the memory only. They belong to the bygone days, they are linked with history. They make us think of the road, of those days when highwaymen rode. I saw at once that the Donjon Inn was at least 2 centuries old, perhaps older. Under its signboard, over the threshold, a man with a crabbed-looking face was standing, seemingly plunged in unpleasant thought, if the wrinkles on his forehead and the knitting of his brows were any indication. When we were close to him, he deigned to see us and asked us, in a tone anything but engaging, whether we wanted anything. He was, no doubt, the not very amiable landlord of this charming dwelling-place. As we expressed a hope that he would be good enough to furnish us with a breakfast, he assured us that he had no provisions, regarding us, as he said this, with a look that was unmistakably suspicious. "You may take us in," Rouletabille said to him. "We're not policemen." "I'm not afraid of the police. I'm not afraid of anyone," replied the man. I had made my friend understand by a sign that we should do better not to insist, but being determined to enter the inn, he slipped by the man on the doorstep and was in the common room. "Come on," he said. "It is very comfortable here." A good fire was blazing in the chimney, and we held our hands to the warmth it sent out. It was a morning in which the approach of winter was unmistakable. The room was a tolerably large one, furnished with 2 heavy tables, some stools, a counter decorated with rows of bottles of syrup and alcohol. 3 windows looked out onto the road. A colored advertisement lauded the many merits of a new vermouth. On the mantelpiece was arrayed the innkeeper's collection of figured earthenware pots and stone jugs. "That's a fine fire for roasting a chicken," said Rouletabille. "We have no chicken, not even a wretched rabbit," said the landlord. "I know," said my friend slowly. "I know. We shall have to eat red meat now." I confess I did not in the least understand what Rouletabille meant by what he had said, but the landlord, as soon as he heard the words, uttered an oath, which he at once stifled, and placed himself at our orders, as obediently as Monsieur Robert Darzac had done, when he heard Rouletabille's prophetic sentence, "The presbytery has lost nothing of its charm, nor the garden its brightness." Certainly my friend knew how to make people understand him by the use of wholly incomprehensible phrases. I observed as much to him, but he merely smiled. I should have proposed that he give me some explanation, but he put a finger to his lips, which evidently signified that he had not only determined not to speak, but also enjoined silence on my part. Meantime, the man had pushed open a little side door and called to somebody to bring him 6 eggs and a piece of beefsteak. The commission was quickly executed by a strongly built young woman with beautiful blonde hair and large, handsome eyes, who regarded us with curiosity. The innkeeper said to her roughly, "Get out, and if the green man comes, don't let me see him." She disappeared, Rouletabille took the eggs, which had been brought to him in a bowl, and the meat, which was on a dish, placed all carefully beside him in the chimney, unhooked a frying pan and a gridiron, and began to beat up our omelette before proceeding to grill our beefsteak. He then ordered 2 bottles of cider, and seemed to take as little notice of our host as our host did of him. The landlord let us do our own cooking, and set our table near one of the windows. Suddenly I heard him mutter, "Ah, there he is." His face had changed, expressing fierce hatred. He went and glued himself to one of the windows, watching the road. There was no need for me to draw Rouletabille's attention. He had already left our omelette and had joined the landlord at the window. I went with him. A man dressed entirely in green velvet, his head covered with a huntsman's cap of the same color, was advancing leisurely, lighting a pipe as he walked. He carried a fowling piece slung at his back. His movements displayed an almost aristocratic ease. He wore eyeglasses and appeared to be about 45 years of age. His hair, as well as his mustache, was salt gray. He was remarkably handsome. As he passed near the inn, he hesitated, as if asking himself whether or no he should enter it, gave a glance towards us, took a few whiffs at his pipe, and then resumed his walk at the same nonchalant pace. Rouletabille and I looked at our host. His flashing eyes, his clenched hands, his trembling lips told us of the tumultuous feelings by which he was being agitated. "He has done well not to come in here today," he hissed. "Who is that man?" asked Rouletabille, returning to his omelette. "The Green Man," growled the innkeeper. "Don't you know him? Then all the better for you. He is not an acquaintance to make. Well, he is Monsieur Stangerson's forest-keeper." "You don't like him very much?" asked the reporter, pouring his omelette into the frying-pan. "Nobody likes him, monsieur. He's an upstart who must once have had a fortune of his own, and he forgives nobody, because in order to live he has been compelled to become a servant. A keeper is as much a servant as any other, isn't he? Upon my word, one would say that he is the master of the Glandier, and that all the land and woods belong to him. He'll not let a poor creature eat a morsel of bread on the grass. His grass." "Does he often come here?" "Too often. But I've made him understand that his face doesn't please me, and for a month past he hasn't been here. The Donjon Inn has never existed for him. He hasn't had time. Been too much engaged in paying court to the landlady of the 3 Lilies at Saint-Michel. A bad fellow. There isn't an honest man who can bear him. Why, the concierges of the chateau would turn their eyes away from a picture of him." "The concierges of the chateau are honest people, then?" "Yes, they are, as true as my name's Matthew, monsieur. I believe them to be honest." "Yet they've been arrested." "What does that prove? But I don't want to mix myself up in other people's affairs." "And what do you think of the murder?" "Of the murder of poor Mademoiselle Stangerson? A good girl, much loved everywhere in the country. That's what I think of it. And many things besides, but that's nobody's business." "Not even mine?" insisted Rouletabille. The innkeeper looked at him sideways and said gruffly, "Not even yours." The omelette ready, we sat down at table and were silently eating, when the door was pushed open and an old woman, dressed in rags, leaning on a stick, her head doddering, her white hair hanging loosely over her wrinkled forehead, appeared on the threshold. "Ah, there you are, Mother Angenoux. It's long since we saw you last," said our host. "I have been ill, very nearly dying," said the old woman. "If ever you should have any scraps for the bête de bon Dieu?" And she entered, followed by a cat, larger than any I had ever believed could exist. The beast looked at us, and gave so hopeless a meow that I shuddered. I had never heard so lugubrious a cry. As if drawn by the cat's cry, a man followed the old woman in. It was the Green Man. He saluted by raising his hand to his cap, and seated himself at a table near to ours. "A glass of cider, Daddy Matthew," he said. As the Green Man entered, Daddy Matthew had started violently, but visibly mastering himself, he said, "I've no more cider. I served the last bottles to these gentlemen." "Then give me a glass of white wine," said the Green Man, without showing the least surprise. "I've no more white wine. No more anything," said Daddy Matthew surlily. "How's Madame Matthew?" "Quite well, thank you." So the young woman with the large, tender eyes whom we had just seen was the wife of this repugnant and brutal rustic, whose jealousy seemed to emphasize his physical ugliness. Slamming the door behind him, the innkeeper left the room. Mother Angenoux was still standing, leaning on her stick, the cat at her feet. "You've been ill, Mother Angenoux. Is that why we have not seen you for the last week?" asked the Green Man. "Yes, Monsieur Keeper. I have been able to get up but 3 times, to go to pray to Sainte Geneviève, our good patroness, and the rest of the time I have been lying on my bed. There was no one to care for me but the Bête de Bon Dieu." "Did she not leave you?" "Neither by day nor by night." "Are you sure of that?" "As I am of paradise." "Then how was it, Madame Angenoux, that all through the night of the murder nothing but the cry of the Bête de Bon Dieu was heard?" Mother Angenoux planted herself in front of the forest keeper and struck the floor with her stick. "I don't know anything about it," she said. "But shall I tell you something? There are no 2 cats in the world that cry like that. Well, on the night of the murder I also heard the cry of the Bête de Bon Dieu outside, and yet she was on my knees and did not mew once, I swear. I crossed myself when I heard that, as if I had heard the devil." I looked at the keeper when he put the last question, and I am much mistaken if I did not detect an evil smile on his lips. At that moment the noise of loud quarrelling reached us. We even thought we heard a dull sound of blows, as if someone was being beaten. The Green Man quickly rose and hurried to the door by the side of the fireplace, but it was opened by the landlord, who appeared and said to the keeper, "Don't alarm yourself, monsieur. It is my wife. She has the toothache." And he laughed. "Here, Mother Angenoux, here are some scraps for your cat." He held out a packet to the old woman, who took it eagerly and went out by the door, closely followed by her cat. "Then you won't serve me?" asked the Green Man. Daddy Matthew's face was placid and no longer retained its expression of hatred. "I've nothing for you. Nothing for you. Take yourself off." The Green Man quietly refilled his pipe, lit it, bowed to us, and went out. No sooner was he over the threshold than Daddy Matthew slammed the door after him, and turning towards us with eyes bloodshot and frothing at the mouth, he hissed to us, shaking his clenched fist at the door he had just shut on the man he evidently hated. "I don't know who you are who tell me we shall have to eat red meat now, but if it will interest you to know it, that man is the murderer." With which words Daddy Matthew immediately left us. Rouletabille returned towards the fireplace and said, "Now we'll grill our steak. How do you like the cider? It's a little tart, but I like it." We saw no more of Daddy Matthew that day, and absolute silence reigned in the inn when we left it, after placing 5 francs on the table in payment for our feast. Rouletabille at once set off on a 3-mile walk round Professor Stangerson's estate. He halted for some 10 minutes at the corner of a narrow road, black with soot, near to some charcoal burners' huts in the forest of Sainte Geneviève, which touches on the road from Épinay to Corbeil, to tell me that the murderer had certainly passed that way, before entering the grounds and concealing himself in the little clump of trees. "You don't think, then, that the keeper knows anything of it?" I asked. "We shall see that later," he replied. "For the present, I'm not interested in what the landlord said about the man. The landlord hates him. I didn't take you to breakfast at the Donjon Inn for the sake of the Green Man." Then Rouletabille, with great precaution, glided, followed by me, towards the little building, which, standing near the park gate, served for the home of the concierges, who had been arrested that morning. With the skill of an acrobat, he got into the lodge by an upper window, which had been left open, and returned 10 minutes later. He said only, "Ah," a word which, in his mouth, signified many things. We were about to take the road leading to the chateau, when a considerable stir at the park gate attracted our attention. A carriage had arrived, and some people had come out from the chateau to meet it. Rouletabille pointed out to me a gentleman who descended from it. "That's the chief of the Sûreté," he said. "Now we shall see what Frederick Larsen has up his sleeve, and whether he is so much cleverer than anybody else." The carriage of the chief of the Sûreté was followed by 3 other vehicles containing reporters, who were also desirous of entering the park. But 2 gendarmes stationed at the gate had evidently received orders to refuse admission to anybody. The chief of the Sûreté calmed their impatience by undertaking to furnish to the press, that evening, all the information he could give that would not interfere with the judicial inquiry. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Gloria Zablicki, Floral Park, New York.